Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundation of Deception. Andrew Fish had built his empire from nothing. At 38, he owned 17 commercial properties across downtown Chicago, a private equity firm, and enough liquid assets to fund small countries. His success story was legendary in business circles. A kid from the South Side who turned a single borrowed $1,000 into a fortune that made him one of the city's youngest billionaires. But Andrew's greatest pride wasn't his wealth. It was Kristen Fish, his wife of 8 years. Or so he thought. Kristen had been a struggling culinary school graduate when they met at a charity gala. Andrew was immediately drawn to her passion for food and her dream of opening a world-class restaurant. She spoke with such fire about revolutionizing Chicago's dining scene that Andrew found himself more captivated by her ambition than by any business deal he'd ever made. "I want to create something that matters," Kristen had told him on their third date, her eyes bright with possibility. Not just another restaurant, but a place where food becomes art, where every meal tells a story. Andrew had fallen hard. Within 6 months, they were married. Within 2 years, he'd quietly begun setting aside money for her dream restaurant. Not because she asked, but because he wanted to surprise her when the time was right. What Andrew didn't know was that Kristen had been planning something entirely different. The first red flag should have been Gordon Myers. Kristen had hired him as head chef 6 months ago, claiming he was a revolutionary talent she discovered working at a small bistro in Portland. Gordon was everything Andrew wasn't: tall, heavily tattooed, with the kind of rugged arrogance that some women found irresistible. "He's exactly what we need," Kristen had insisted when Andrew questioned the hire. "Gordon understands my vision in ways that other people don't." Andrew had noticed the way Gordon looked at his wife during their dinner meetings. He'd seen how Kristen's laugh became different around Gordon, more musical, more alive. But Andrew Fish hadn't become successful by jumping to conclusions. He watched. He waited. He gathered information. The second red flag was the sudden secrecy. Kristen, who had once shared every detail of her restaurant planning with Andrew, began having private meetings. She'd leave early in the morning for vendor visits and return late with stories that didn't quite add up. When Andrew offered to join her for these meetings, she'd find excuses. "You're too busy with your own empire," she'd say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Let me handle my little dream restaurant." Little. The word stung every time she used it. Andrew had quietly allocated $15 million for this project, enough to create one of the most stunning restaurant spaces in the city. Little was the last word that should describe it. But Andrew kept his suspicions to himself. He was a man who believed in evidence, not paranoia. So he did what he did best: he investigated. Through Randolph Stevenson, his lawyer and closest friend since college, Andrew learned that Kristen had been meeting with food critics, investors, and suppliers without mentioning her husband's involvement. More troubling, she'd been describing the restaurant as her vision brought to life through her own determination and sacrifice. "It's almost like she's rewriting history," Randolph had observed during one of their private dinners. "According to everyone I've spoken with, this restaurant is the result of her savings and a small business loan." Andrew had smiled grimly. "Interesting, considering she's never had more than $30,000 in savings, and I've personally transferred over $2 million to the restaurant's development account." The third and final red flag was the invitation itself. When Kristen handed Andrew the elegant black invitation to the grand opening of Atelier, her restaurant's name, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Under the formal script announcing the opening, in smaller text, it read, "A culinary journey brought to life by Chef Kristen Fish and head chef Gordon Myers, with gratitude to all our supporters." Supporters, plural, anonymous. As if Andrew Fish, who had funded every inch of marble, every custom light fixture, every piece of hand-forged cookware, was just another face in the crowd. That night, as Kristen slept beside him, Andrew sat in his home office, staring at the invitation. He thought about their wedding vows, about the promises they'd made, about the life he thought they were building together. Then he opened his laptop and began making calls. If Kristen wanted to play games, Andrew Fish would show her what a real player looked like. The opening was in 3 days. Andrew had 72 hours to prepare for what would either be the celebration of his wife's dream or the beginning of her worst nightmare. It all depended on what he discovered between now and then. Chapter 2. The Setup. Andrew Fish hadn't survived hostile corporate takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations by being naive. The morning after receiving the invitation, he set his plan in motion with the precision of a master chess player. His first call was to Randolph Stevenson, but not for legal advice, for surveillance. "I need to know everything," Andrew told his lawyer over breakfast at their usual spot, a discreet cafe where half of Chicago's power deals were made. Every meeting Kristen has had in the past month. Every conversation Gordon Myers has had with anyone connected to our restaurant. Every financial transaction, every supplier agreement, every press interview. Randolph raised an eyebrow. "Andrew, what exactly are you expecting to find?" "Betrayal," Andrew said simply. "The question is how deep it goes." Within hours, Randolph's private investigator, a former FBI agent named Laura Hartman, had compiled a file that made Andrew's suspicions look like optimistic thinking. The evidence was damning. Kristen had been telling food critics that Atelier was her personal triumph over the obstacles that tried to keep her down. She'd given interviews describing how she'd fought tooth and nail to secure funding, never mentioning Andrew's $15 million investment. Most tellingly, she'd told Chicago Food and Wine magazine that the restaurant's success would prove that a woman doesn't need a man's money to achieve her dreams. But the personal betrayal cut deeper than the financial deception. Laura's surveillance had captured audio of Kristen and Gordon during their private dinner at the Ritz-Carlton the previous Tuesday. Andrew listened to the recording in the privacy of his office, his jaw tightening with each word. "After tomorrow night, everything changes." Kristen's voice was clear through the high-quality microphone. "Andrew has no idea what's coming. He thinks this is all about supporting my little hobby." Gordon's response was even worse. The look on his face when he realizes you don't need him anymore is going to be priceless. Maybe then he'll understand that money can't buy respect or love. "Oh, Gordon," Kristen had laughed. "You have no idea how satisfying this is going to be. Andrew Fish has spent our entire marriage thinking he's the hero of this story. Tomorrow night, he finds out he's just a bankroll." Andrew turned off the recording and sat in silence for several minutes. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of believing he'd found his partner, his equal, his future. All of it had been an elaborate performance. But Andrew Fish hadn't become one of Chicago's most successful entrepreneurs by wallowing in self-pity. He'd built his fortune by turning disadvantages into advantages, by seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. His second call was to Brett Moore, his property acquisition specialist. "Brett, I need you to research the building at 1247 North State Street. Everything, ownership history, lease agreements, mortgage details, and current market value. The new restaurant district building? That's prime real estate, Andrew. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it might be available soon." While Brett worked on the property research, Andrew made his third call to Mel Swartz, his head of strategic operations. "Mel, I need a complete financial audit of every transaction related to my wife's restaurant project. Every penny in, every penny out, every contract, every agreement. I want to know exactly where my money went and who has legal claim to what." "How detailed do you want this, boss?" "Detailed enough to hold up in court." The picture that emerged over the next 48 hours was a masterpiece of manipulation. Kristen had indeed used Andrew's money to fund Atelier, but she'd structured the agreements to make it appear as though she was the primary investor. The restaurant was officially owned by a corporation that Kristen controlled, with Gordon Myers holding a significant equity stake, something Andrew had never agreed to. More problematic, the lease agreement for the building was in Kristen's name alone, with Andrew listed merely as a financial guarantor. In the event of a divorce, the restaurant would belong entirely to Kristen, while Andrew would be legally responsible for all debts and obligations. It was brilliant in a sociopathic way. Kristen had essentially used Andrew's money to buy herself both a business and an exit strategy from their marriage. But Andrew had one advantage his wife hadn't counted on: the building itself. Brett's research revealed that 1247 North State Street was owned by Darren Brooks, an elderly real estate investor who'd been quietly looking to sell his portfolio for months. The building was worth approximately $40 million, but Brooks was motivated to close quickly due to health concerns. Andrew made the call himself. "Mr. Brooks, this is Andrew Fish. I understand you might be interested in selling 1247 North State Street." "Well, Mr. Fish, I've heard of you, of course." "Yes, I've been considering it. Do you have a specific offer in mind?" $45 million. Cash. Close in 48 hours. There was a long pause. "Mr. Fish, that's very generous. But the building has tenants with long-term leases. It's not exactly a simple transaction." Andrew smiled. "Mr. Brooks, I didn't get where I am by being afraid of complexity. $45 million, and I'll handle all the tenant transition issues myself. Are you interested?" Yes. Yes, I believe I am." As Andrew hung up the phone, he looked out his office window at the Chicago skyline. Tomorrow night, Kristen thought she was going to humiliate him in front of Chicago's food elite. She thought she was going to publicly announce his irrelevance while stealing his money and his dignity. Instead, she was about to learn a lesson that Andrew hoped would serve as a warning to anyone else who thought Andrew Fish was just another wealthy man to be manipulated. The grand opening was tomorrow night. Andrew had 24 hours to finalize his acquisition and prepare for what would be either the most expensive lesson he'd ever taught or the most satisfying revenge he'd ever taken. He was betting on the latter. Chapter 3. The Grand Opening Disaster. The evening of Atelier's grand opening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Chicago feel electric with possibility. Andrew Fish stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with the same calm precision he brought to every important negotiation. Tonight, he looked every inch the successful businessman. Charcoal suit, platinum watch, the kind of understated confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was worth. Kristen emerged from their walk-in closet wearing a stunning black dress that Andrew had bought for her last Christmas. She looked radiant, glowing with the anticipation of her moment of triumph. "You look beautiful," Andrew said, and meant it. Even knowing what she'd done, what she was planning to do, he could still see the woman he'd fallen in love with. Kristen smiled, but there was something different in her eyes. A hardness that Andrew now realized had probably been there for years, carefully hidden beneath layers of charm and affection. "Thank you," she said, kissing his cheek. "Tonight is going to be perfect." They rode to the restaurant in Andrew's Tesla in relative silence. Kristen spent the drive checking her phone, responding to last-minute messages from Gordon and the restaurant staff. Andrew spent it thinking about the conversation he'd had with Randolph that afternoon. "The building purchase is finalized," his lawyer had confirmed. "As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, you own 1247 North State Street. All tenant leases are now under your control, including Atelier's 5-year agreement. And the financial audit? Complete. You have legal claim to every asset purchased with your money, which is essentially everything in that restaurant except the salt and pepper shakers. If you want to press charges for fraud, we have enough evidence to put both Kristen and Gordon in prison." Andrew had considered that option. The betrayal certainly deserved prison time, but he decided on something more immediate, more personal, and ultimately more devastating than a lengthy court battle. He was going to destroy them the same way they'd planned to destroy him, publicly, humiliatingly, and completely. Atelier was everything Andrew had envisioned when he'd first begun funding Kristen's dream. The interior was a masterpiece of modern elegance: soaring ceilings, hand-blown glass light fixtures, custom woodwork that had cost more than most people's houses. Every detail was perfect, from the imported Italian marble floors to the state-of-the-art kitchen that could be seen through floor-to-ceiling windows. The guest list was Chicago's elite: food critics, business leaders, politicians, and celebrities. Andrew recognized faces from magazine covers and society pages. Everyone who mattered in the city was here to witness what they thought would be Kristen Fish's triumph. For the first hour, Everything proceeded exactly as Kristen had planned. Guests sampled Gordon's carefully crafted appetizers, praised the restaurant's stunning design, and congratulated Kristen on her incredible achievement. Andrew played his role perfectly. The supportive husband, proud of his wife's success, content to stand in the background while she basked in the spotlight. Then came the speeches. Gordon Myers stepped up to the microphone first. He was every inch the celebrity chef, tall, commanding, with the kind of swagger that suggested he believed his own press releases. "Welcome to Atelier," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "This restaurant represents more than just great food. It represents the power of vision, determination, and refusing to compromise your dreams." He went on to describe the incredible journey that had brought Atelier to life, carefully omitting any mention of the $15 million that had made the entire project possible. Instead, he spoke of scraping together resources and believing in ourselves when no one else would. Then he turned to Kristen, his eyes bright with what Andrew now recognized as something far more intimate than professional admiration. "But most importantly," Gordon continued, "this restaurant exists because of one person's unwavering commitment to excellence." Kristen Fish didn't just dream of creating something beautiful. She made it happen through her own strength, her own vision, and her own sacrifice. The applause was thunderous. Andrew clapped along, his smile never wavering. It was Kristen's turn. She took the microphone with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won. Andrew watched from the side of the room as his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, prepared to deliver what she clearly thought would be her moment of ultimate triumph. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Kristen began. "This restaurant has been my dream for years, and seeing it come to life has been the most rewarding experience of my life." She paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes found Andrew. For just a moment, he saw something that might have been regret cross her face. Then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. "I want to thank everyone who believed in this vision," she continued. "But I especially want to thank the person who has been the real backbone of this project, someone who understood my dream from the very beginning and helped make it a reality through their talent, their dedication, and their unwavering support." Andrew felt the room's attention shift toward him. Several guests began to applaud, assuming Kristen was about to acknowledge her husband's financial support. Instead, Kristen turned toward Gordon Myers. "Gordon Myers, you're the real backbone of Atelier. Without your vision, your expertise, and your partnership, none of this would have been possible." The applause that followed was confused, scattered. Andrew could see guests looking between him and Gordon, trying to understand the dynamic they were witnessing. But Kristen wasn't finished. "In fact," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I've decided to name our signature dish in honor of someone very special to me. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in celebrating the debut of Gordon's greatest creation, the Loser's Filet." The crowd laughed, thinking it was a clever play on words. They had no idea they were witnessing a public execution. Andrew felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise, he'd been expecting something like this. But the sheer cruelty of it, the calculated humiliation, was breathtaking in its audacity. Kristen raised her glass. "To Gordon Myers, my true partner in bringing Atelier to life." As the crowd toasted, Andrew Fish made a decision. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the exit, making sure Kristen could see him leaving. Outside, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Randolph Stevenson. "Execute the plan. All of it. Now." The second was to the building's utilities provider. "This is Andrew Fish, the new owner of 1247 North State Street. I need you to shut off power to the building immediately." "Yes, I understand there's an event happening. That's exactly why I'm calling." As Andrew walked to his car, he could hear the confused murmur of voices from inside Atelier as the lights went out. His phone was already buzzing with incoming calls. Kristen, Gordon, the restaurant manager, probably half the staff. He ignored them all. By the time he reached his penthouse, his phone showed 387 missed calls. Andrew poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch and sat down to wait. The real show was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Trap Springs. Andrew Fish stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights blur into abstract patterns through the glass. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the past 2 hours. 387 missed calls and counting, but he hadn't answered a single one. Instead, he was savoring the silence, the calm before the storm he was about to unleash. The knock on his door came at exactly 11:47 p.m. Andrew opened it to find Kristen standing in the hallway, still wearing her grand opening dress, but looking far from triumphant. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from tears she'd obviously tried to hide. "Andrew," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of rage and desperation. "What the hell have you done?" Andrew stepped aside to let her enter, his expression neutral. "Come in, Kristen. We need to talk." She stormed past him into the living room, spinning around to face him with eyes blazing. "You shut down my restaurant on opening night. Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation? To my career? Your restaurant?" Andrew's voice remained calm, conversational. "That's interesting, because according to the property records I filed this afternoon, I own the building. And according to the financial records my lawyer has compiled, I own everything inside it." Kristen's face went white. "That's impossible. The restaurant is mine. I have the lease agreement. A lease agreement that I, as the building's new owner, have every right to terminate." Andrew walked to his bar and poured himself another scotch. "Would you like a drink? You look like you could use one. Don't you dare act casual about this." Kristen's voice cracked with hysteria. "You've destroyed everything I worked for." Andrew took a slow sip of his drink, studying his wife's face. Even in crisis, she was beautiful. It was a shame she was also a sociopath. "Everything you worked for," he repeated. "Tell me, Kristen, exactly what did you work for? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you worked to steal $15 million of my money, commit fraud, and publicly humiliate me in front of half of Chicago." "It wasn't like that." "Really?" Andrew reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "Because I have recordings that suggest otherwise." He pressed play. Kristen's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "Andrew has no idea what's coming. He thinks this is all about supporting my little hobby." Kristen sank onto the couch as her own words condemned her. "How did you?" "Private investigator. Surveillance equipment. The same tools I use for hostile takeovers." Andrew turned off the recorder. "Did you really think I'd built a billion-dollar empire by being naive about people's motivations?" For a long moment, Kristen said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, defeated. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something," Andrew said, sitting across from her. "For 8 years, I believed you loved me. I believed we were partners. I believed that everything I was building for us." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to discover that the person you trust most in the world has been planning to destroy you?" Kristen's eyes filled with tears. "Andrew, I never meant for it to go this far. It started as just, I don't know, a way to prove I could do something on my own. But then Gordon got involved, and things got complicated." "Gordon?" Andrew's voice turned ice cold. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He disappeared right after the power went out. His phone goes straight to voicemail." Andrew smiled, and something in that expression made Kristen shrink back into the couch. "Actually, I know exactly where Gordon is," Andrew said. "He's at Chicago PD headquarters, being questioned about the $15,000 in cash they found in his apartment this evening." "What cash?" "Andrew, what are you talking about?" "The cash that my security team planted there this afternoon, along with some very interesting documents suggesting that Gordon Myers has been embezzling money from restaurant suppliers." Andrew's smile widened. Amazing how a little creative evidence can completely change someone's story. Kristen stared at him in horror. "You framed him." "I destroyed him," Andrew corrected. "Just like he planned to destroy me. The difference is, I'm better at it." Andrew's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and nodded with satisfaction. "Ah, perfect timing. That's my lawyer. Gordon just confessed to embezzlement and implicated you as an accomplice." "But I never." "Of course you didn't. But Gordon doesn't know that. All he knows is that the police found evidence of financial crimes, and he was given a choice. cooperate and get a reduced sentence, or take the fall for everything. Andrew stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd conquered through intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. "Here's what's going to happen," he said without turning around. "You're going to sign divorce papers that give me everything: the restaurant, the building, and every asset we've acquired during our marriage. In return, I'll make sure the police understand that you were a victim of Gordon's manipulation, not a willing participant. And if I refuse?" Andrew turned to face her, and Kristen saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before: the cold, calculating stare of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "If you refuse, I'll make sure everyone in Chicago knows exactly what you are. The recordings, the financial fraud, the adultery, all of it will become public. Your career will be over, your reputation will be destroyed, and you'll spend the next 5 to 10 years in prison." Andrew finished his scotch and set the glass down with deliberate precision. "But that's not the worst part, Kristen. The worst part is that I'll make sure you understand exactly how easily I could have destroyed you at any time during our marriage. All those years you thought you were manipulating me? I was watching. I was learning. I was preparing." He walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "I have 8 years' worth of evidence documenting every lie you've told, every scheme you've attempted, every betrayal you've committed. Did you really think a man who built a billion-dollar empire wouldn't notice his wife's amateur hour manipulation?" Kristen opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, documents, recorded conversations, financial records, a complete dossier of her deceptions. "The truth is," Andrew said softly, "I could have stopped you at any time, but I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted to see just how much you were willing to destroy for your pathetic little revenge fantasy." He sat back down across from her, his expression almost gentle. "And now I know." Chapter 5: The Unraveling. The morning after Kristen's confrontation with Andrew, Chicago's media exploded with the story of Atelier's spectacular opening night failure. But the narrative wasn't what Kristen had expected. Instead of portraying her as a victim of her husband's vindictive business practices, the stories painted a picture of financial fraud, adultery, and spectacular karma. Somehow, reporters had gotten hold of details about the embezzlement investigation, the building purchase, and even quotes from anonymous sources describing Kristen's public humiliation of her husband. Kristen sat in her sister's apartment, having been locked out of the penthouse the previous night, reading story after story on her laptop with growing horror. Chicago Business Journal led with "Tech Billionaire's Wife Exposed in Restaurant Fraud Scheme." Chicago Tribune went with "Atelier Opening Night Disaster, When Revenge Backfires." But it was the Chicago Sun-Times headline that made her stomach drop: "The Loser's Fillet, How Kristen Fish Learned the Hard Way That You Don't Humiliate a Billionaire." Her phone rang. It was Monica Padilla, the food critic from Chicago Food and Wine, who had promised to write a glowing review of Atelier. "Kristen," Monica's voice was professional but cold, "I'm calling to let you know that we won't be running the plan feature on Atelier, given the circumstances." "Monica, please, you don't understand. My husband is. I understand perfectly. I also understand that you told me this restaurant was funded through your personal savings and a small business loan. $15 million is hardly a small business loan, is it?" The line went dead. That call was followed by another, then another. Suppliers demanding immediate payment for invoices they'd been told would be handled by Ms. Fish's business manager. Food critics withdrawing invitations to industry events. Even the cleaning service that maintained Atelier's pristine appearance called to say their services were no longer needed. By noon, Kristen understood that her professional life was over. But she didn't understand how completely Andrew had orchestrated its destruction until Randolph Stevenson knocked on her sister's door. "Ms. Fish," Andrew's lawyer said, his tone respectful but firm, "I need you to come with me." "Where?" "Chicago Police Department. You're not under arrest, but they have some questions about the financial irregularities at Atelier." The interrogation room at CPD was exactly like the ones in TV shows: bare walls, fluorescent lighting, and a metal table with uncomfortable chairs. Detective Herbert Valencia was a large man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely sorry to be questioning her. "Ms. Fish, I want you to understand that we consider you a potential victim in this case, not a suspect. But we need to understand your relationship with Gordon Myers and your knowledge of the financial creative accounting that was happening at your restaurant. What creative accounting? I don't know what you're talking about. Detective Valencia opened a file and spread several documents across the table. These are invoices submitted to your restaurant by various suppliers. The amounts charged to your business accounts were significantly higher than the amounts these suppliers actually charged. Kristen stared at the papers, her confusion genuine. I don't understand. Gordon handled all the supplier relationships. He said it was better to have one point of contact for her. For embezzling approximately $200,000 over the past 6 months, the detective finished. We found detailed records in Mr. Myers' apartment showing how he was inflating invoices and pocketing the difference. But that's impossible. I would have noticed. Would you? Because according to our investigation, you rarely reviewed the financial details of the restaurant's operations. You trusted Mr. Myers to handle those aspects while you focused on other things. Detective Valencia's tone remained professional, but Kristen caught the implication. Other things like planning her husband's public humiliation. Ms. Fish, we have evidence that suggests Mr. Myers may have been manipulating you as well as stealing from you. Text messages, recorded conversations, financial records that indicate he was planning to take control of the restaurant once your marriage ended. The detective slid another document across the table. It was a business partnership agreement between Kristen and Gordon dated 2 weeks ago that she'd never seen before. Did you sign this? Kristen examined the document. Her signature was there, but she had no memory of signing it. I think so. Gordon said it was just a formality to make sure he had legal standing to make decisions when I wasn't available. This document gives Mr. Myers 51% ownership of Atelier, effective immediately upon your divorce from Andrew Fish. The room spun. Kristen felt like she was falling down a rabbit hole where nothing made sense. That can't be right. The restaurant is mine. I built it. You built it with your husband's money, then signed legal control over to a man who was stealing from you. Detective Valencia's voice was gentle but firm. Ms. Fish, I think you need to consider the possibility that you were never the mastermind of this scheme. You were the mark. 3 hours later, Kristen emerged from the police station feeling like her entire world had been turned upside down. Gordon hadn't just betrayed Andrew. He'd betrayed her too. The man she'd thought was her partner in revenge had been setting her up to take the fall while he walked away with everything. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at Grant Park. North End. Come alone. Gee, Gordon. He must have made bail, or been released, or escaped somehow. Despite everything, Kristen felt a flutter of hope. Maybe he could explain. Maybe there's a way to fix this. She found him sitting on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan, looking nothing like the confident chef who'd charmed Chicago's food elite. His clothes were wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and there was something in his eyes that made Kristen's skin crawl. Gordon, thank God. The police said you. Shut up and sit down. His voice was harsh, desperate. We need to talk. Kristen sat, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. The park was nearly empty, and Gordon was acting like a man with nothing to lose. They released me on bail, Gordon said without preamble. But I'm finished. The embezzlement charges will stick. They have too much evidence. The only question is whether I go down alone or take you with me. Take me with you? Gordon, I didn't know about any embezzlement. I trusted you. You trusted me? Gordon laughed bitterly. You used me, just like I used you. The only difference is I was better at it. He turned to face her, and Kristen saw something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't the charming, confident man she'd fallen for. This was someone capable of genuine violence. Here's what's going to happen, Gordon said. You're going to tell the police that the embezzlement was your idea, that you pressured me into inflating those invoices to hide assets from your husband during the divorce. I won't do that. I can't. Gordon's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. You will do that, because if you don't, I'll tell them about the plan to drug your husband. Kristen's blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? The plan you came up with to slip something into Andrew's drink on opening night. To make him sick, embarrass him in front of all those people. The plan you abandoned at the last minute because you got cold feet. That never happened. We never. I have recordings that say otherwise. Conversations where you discussed dosing his drink with ipecac to make him vomit during your speech. Insurance. In case the public humiliation wasn't enough. Gordon smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Kristen had ever seen. Amazing what modern technology can do. Voice synthesis, audio editing. It's almost impossible to tell what's real anymore. Kristen tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. You're insane. No one will believe that. Maybe not, but it'll be enough to destroy what's left of your reputation. And given your current legal troubles, it might be enough to convince a jury that you're capable of anything. Gordon released her wrist and stood up. You have 24 hours to decide. Take the fall for the embezzlement, or I'll make sure you take the fall for attempted poisoning too. As he walked away, Kristen sat alone on the bench, finally understanding the full scope of the trap that had been closing around her. Andrew had been right. She'd never been the mastermind of anything. She'd been a pawn in someone else's game from the very beginning. But the question now was, whose game was it really? Chapter 6. The Revelation. Andrew Fish stood in his private office at Fish Enterprises, reviewing the morning's reports with the satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent's inevitable defeat. The Kristen situation was proceeding exactly as planned, but there were still a few pieces to move before the game was complete. His assistant knocked and entered. Mr. Fish, Detective Valencia is here to see you. Andrew nodded. Send him in. Herbert Valencia entered looking like a man who'd been wrestling with uncomfortable questions. Mr. Fish, thank you for seeing me. I know you're busy dealing with your personal situation. Not at all, Detective. I'm happy to help with your investigation in any way I can. Valencia sat down across from Andrew's massive desk, his expression thoughtful. I have to ask you directly, Mr. Fish. How much of this did you know in advance? Andrew raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I understand your question. The embezzlement, the fraud, the partnership agreement that would have given Myers control of your wife's restaurant. A man with your resources, your intelligence. It's hard to believe you were completely blindsided by any of this. Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying the detective's face. Valencia was sharper than he'd initially appeared. Time for a calculated risk. Detective, can I speak to you off the record? That depends on what you want to say. I suspected my wife was having an affair. I had her watched, investigated, monitored. What I discovered was far worse than adultery. It was an elaborate scheme to steal my money and destroy my reputation. Andrew stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. So yes, I knew what was coming. And yes, I prepared for it. How prepared? Andrew smiled. I bought the building her restaurant was in. I documented every financial transaction. I gathered evidence of every crime they committed. And when they finally made their move, I was ready. Valencia nodded slowly. What about the embezzlement evidence we found in Myers' apartment? What about it? Our forensics team says some of those documents were printed less than 48 hours ago, on paper that matches the supplies in your office building's print center. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Andrew turned to face the detective. Are you suggesting I planted evidence, Detective? I'm suggesting that a man with your resources could arrange for evidence to be discovered if he wanted it to be discovered. Andrew walked back to his desk and sat down. Detective Valencia, let me ask you a question. If a man discovers that his wife and her lover are planning to steal millions of dollars from him, commit fraud, and destroy his reputation, what do you think the appropriate response should be? He should call the police. And if the police say there's not enough evidence for criminal charges? If the legal system would require years of litigation while the perpetrators continue their scheme? Valencia frowned. That doesn't justify planting evidence, doesn't it? Andrew's voice remained calm, conversational. Let me tell you what Gordon Myers was really planning, Detective. The embezzlement was just the beginning. Andrew opened his desk drawer and pulled out another folder. Myers had been researching methods to incapacitate someone without leaving traces. He'd purchased Rohypnol through an online pharmacy. He'd been asking questions about my life insurance policies. He slid several documents across the desk. I believe Gordon Myers was planning to murder me, make it look like an accident or suicide, and then take control of my assets through my wife. Valencia examined the documents, credit card receipts, internet search histories, pharmacy records. How did you get these? The same private investigator who discovered the affair also discovered the murder plot. The question is, detective, if you knew someone was planning to kill you, how far would you go to stop them? The detective set the papers down, his expression troubled. Even if this is all true, Mr. Fish, you can't just fabricate evidence and expect. I didn't fabricate anything, Andrew interrupted. I simply made sure that evidence of Myers' actual crimes was discovered in a way that would be immediately actionable. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes intense. Gordon Myers was stealing money, planning murder, and manipulating my wife to destroy my life. The evidence you found in his apartment, it was all real. The documents, the financial records, the cash, all of it came from his actual criminal activities. But you put it there. I organized it. I presented it in a way that would be immediately understandable to investigators. But I didn't create it. Valencia stood up, looking like a man caught between his duty and his pragmatism. Mr. Fish, what you're describing is vigilante justice. What I'm describing is self-defense. Andrew's voice hardened. A man used my wife to get close to me, stole my money, planned my murder, and tried to destroy everything I've built. I stopped him using the same tools he was using against me: intelligence, planning, and superior resources. The detective headed for the door, then paused. What about your wife? Was she really just a victim in all this? Andrew's expression softened slightly. Kristen made her choices, detective. She chose to betray me, to steal from me, to humiliate me publicly. But I don't think she ever intended for anyone to die. So you're protecting her? I'm giving her a chance to make better choices. Whether she takes that chance is up to her. After Valencia left, Andrew sat alone in his office, contemplating the final moves in his elaborate game. Kristen would have to choose between accepting responsibility for her part in the scheme or going down with Gordon. Gordon would either accept a plea deal for the embezzlement or face additional charges for the planned murder. But there was one more revelation coming that would change everything. Andrew's phone buzzed with a text from Laura Hartman, his private investigator, package delivered. She should receive it within the hour. Across town, Kristen Fish was about to discover that the trap she'd fallen into was even more complex than she'd imagined. Chapter 7, The Final Gambit. Kristen returned to her sister's apartment feeling like she was drowning in quicksand. Every move she made seemed to pull her deeper into an impossible situation. Gordon's ultimatum echoed in her head. Take the fall for embezzlement or face fabricated charges for attempted poisoning. She was pouring herself a glass of wine with shaking hands when the doorbell rang. Package for Kristen Fish, said the delivery driver, handing her a manila envelope with no return address. Inside, she found a USB drive and a handwritten note. Play this before you make any decisions about Gordon's offer. A friend. Kristen stared at the drive for several minutes before finally plugging it into her laptop. The screen filled with a video player, and she pressed play. The footage was from a security camera, judging by the timestamp and grainy quality. It showed Gordon Myers in what appeared to be his apartment, talking on the phone. She's completely under control. Gordon's voice was clear despite the poor video quality. Kristen thinks this is all her idea, but she's just following the script I wrote for her. A pause as the person on the other end spoke. Of course I'm going to frame her for the embezzlement. She's so obsessed with revenge against her husband that she'll never see it coming. By the time this is over, Andrew Fish will be humiliated, Kristen will be in prison, and I'll own a $15 million restaurant. Another pause. The poisoning idea was brilliant. Even if she doesn't go through with it, I have recordings that will convince anyone she was planning it. Insurance, you know? Can't be too careful. Kristen's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. What's that? Oh, the murder plot? Yeah, that's still the backup plan. If the legal route doesn't work, I'll just arrange an accident. Rich guy like Andrew Fish, tragic death, grieving widow who inherits everything and happens to be completely dependent on her business partner. It's foolproof. The video ended. Kristen sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she'd just watched. Gordon hadn't just been manipulating her. He'd been planning to destroy both her and Andrew from the beginning. Every conversation, every intimate moment, every shared plan for revenge had been part of an elaborate scheme to steal everything Andrew had built. But who had sent her the video? And how had they gotten security footage from Gordon's apartment? Her phone rang. The caller ID showed private number. "Hello, Kristen." The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. "I trust you found the video enlightening." "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching Gordon Myers for a very long time. Someone who knew exactly what he was planning to do to you and your husband." Kristen's mind raced. "Are you working for Andrew?" A low laugh. "I'm working for justice, Kristen. Gordon Myers has done this before. Other women, other wealthy husbands, other elaborate schemes. Youth and Andrew are just his latest targets." "What do you mean he's done this before?" Portland, Oregon, 2019. A chef named Gordon Myers seduced the wife of a restaurant owner, convinced her to embezzle money, then disappeared when the police started investigating. The wife went to prison. The husband lost everything. Kristen felt sick. "That's impossible. Gordon told me he was working at a small bistro in Portland." He was. A bistro owned by Marcus Webb, whose wife Violet Webb is now serving 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. Sound familiar? The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Where's Marcus Webb now? Suicide. 3 months after his wife's conviction. Couldn't handle the shame and financial ruin. Kristen sank onto the couch, her legs unable to support her. "Oh my God." Denver, Colorado, 2017. Seattle, Washington, 2015. Same pattern, same results. Gordon Myers finds wealthy couples, seduces the wife, manipulates her into betraying her husband, then takes everything and disappears while she takes the blame. How do you know all this? Because I've been hunting him for 3 years. Ever since he destroyed my family. The electronic distortion couldn't hide the pain in the caller's voice. "Who are you?" "I'm Laura Hartman. Marcus Webb was my brother." The name hit Kristen like a physical blow. Laura Hartman, Andrew's private investigator. The woman who had been gathering evidence against Gordon and Kristen for months. "You're working for Andrew." "I'm working against Gordon Myers. Andrew Fish just happens to be his current target." Laura's voice hardened. "The difference is this time the target is smart enough to fight back." So all of this, the surveillance, the evidence, the building purchase, Andrew Fish is protecting himself the same way any intelligent person would. But Gordon Myers picked the wrong mark this time. Andrew has resources, connections, and most importantly, he has me. Kristen's mind reeled. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to help me stop Gordon before he kills your husband and destroys your life the same way he destroyed my brother's." "What can I do?" "I don't have any evidence, any proof. You have something better. You have access. Gordon trusts you, or at least he thinks he's manipulated you enough to control you. He's going to contact you again, probably tonight. When he does, I need you to get him to admit what he's really planning." "You want me to wear a wire?" "I want you to save your husband's life. Because make no mistake, Kristen, Gordon Myers is planning to kill Andrew Fish. The only question is whether you're going to help me stop him or help him do it." The line went dead. Kristen sat in the gathering darkness of her sister's apartment, holding her phone and staring at the broken wine glass on the floor. She thought about Marcus Webb, a man she'd never met who'd lost everything to Gordon's manipulation and taken his own life rather than live with the consequences. She thought about Violet Webb, sitting in a federal prison for crimes she'd probably committed without understanding their true purpose. She thought about Andrew, her husband of 8 years, who she'd betrayed and humiliated, but who had never, in all their time together, been anything but generous and loving. And she thought about Gordon Myers, the man she'd trusted with her heart and her future, who had been planning to murder her husband and frame her for it from the very beginning. When her phone rang again an hour later, she was ready. "Kristen, it's Gordon. We need to meet. Tonight. Things are moving faster than I expected, and we need to finalize our plan." "What plan?" "The plan to make sure Andrew Fish doesn't live to see the end of the week." Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The warehouse Gordon chose for their meeting was in an industrial district south of downtown Chicago. Isolated, dark, and perfect for the kind of conversation that couldn't happen in public. Kristen arrived at midnight, wearing the wire Laura Hartman had given her and trying to control the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. Gordon was already there, pacing near a stack of shipping containers like a caged animal. The confident chef persona had completely disappeared, replaced by something desperate and dangerous. "You're late," he said without preamble. "I had to be careful. The police are watching me." Gordon studied her face in the dim light from the security lamps. "Are you wearing a wire?" Kristen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Are you insane? Why would I wear a wire to a meeting with my co-conspirator?" Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Gordon relaxed slightly. "Good, because what we're about to discuss can never be repeated." He pulled out a tablet and showed her what appeared to be building schematics. "This is the layout of Andrew's penthouse. I've been studying it for months." "How did you get these?" "I have friends in the construction industry. Friends who don't ask too many questions for the right price." Gordon zoomed in on specific areas of the blueprint. "The security system has a vulnerability here in the service elevator shaft. 30 seconds to disable the cameras, 2 minutes to reach his floor, 5 minutes to complete the job." Kristen felt bile rise in her throat. "Complete what job?" Gordon looked at her like she was being deliberately obtuse. "To kill your husband, obviously. We've been planning this for months. I never agreed to murder. You agreed to destroy him. This is just the most permanent way to do it." Gordon's voice was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing dinner plans. "Besides, once he's dead, you inherit everything. The restaurants, the buildings, the investment accounts, all of it becomes yours." "And then what? We split everything 50-50 like some kind of criminal partnership?" Gordon laughed, and the sound made Kristen's skin crawl. "Oh, sweet Kristen, you still don't understand, do you?" He put the tablet away and moved closer to her. In the dim warehouse lighting, his face looked like something from a nightmare. "There is no we. There never was. You're going to inherit Andrew's fortune, yes. But then you're going to have a tragic accident of your own." Grief-stricken widow, overcome with guilt about her husband's death, takes her own life. Very sad. Very understandable. Kristen backed away from him, her hand instinctively reaching for the panic button Laura had given her. "You're insane. I'm practical. Do you know how much money your husband is worth? Including his private investments and offshore accounts, we're talking about nearly $2 billion. That's worth a little temporary insanity, don't you think? You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Gordon's smile widened. Portland was good practice. Denver was even better. But Chicago is the big score. The job that lets me retire to a private island and never work again. What about the other women? The other wives you manipulated? What about them? They served their purpose. Some went to prison, some killed themselves, some just disappeared. It doesn't really matter what happens to them after I get what I need." Gordon pulled out a pistol, holding it casually, but keeping it pointed in Kristen's direction. "The question now is whether you're going to help me finish this job, or whether you're going to join your husband in an early grave." "Help you how?" "Simple. Tomorrow night, you're going to invite Andrew to dinner at a restaurant I've chosen. Somewhere public, but with private dining rooms. Somewhere the security cameras have convenient blind spots." Gordon's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "You're going to slip something into his drink, just a little something to make him dizzy, disoriented. Then you're going to help him to the bathroom, where I'll be waiting. And if I refuse, then I'll kill you right here, right now. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Andrew will spend the rest of his life wondering what happened to his beloved wife." Kristen realized that everything Laura Hartman had told her was true. Gordon Myers was a predator who had perfected his method through years of practice. She wasn't his first victim. She was just the latest in a long line of women he'd used and destroyed. But she also realized something else. Gordon had made a critical mistake. He'd assumed that Kristen was the same naive, easily manipulated woman he'd been grooming for months. He had no idea that she'd learned the truth about his past, or that she was working with people who were prepared to stop him. "Okay," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'll do it." Gordon smiled with genuine warmth for the first time all evening. "I knew you'd see reason. You're going to be very wealthy for a very short time." "When do we do this?" Tomorrow night. I've already made the reservation at Chez Laurent. Private dining room. Perfect for our needs. Gordon put the gun away and moved closer to her again. You know, Kristen, in another life, we might have actually been partners. You have a ruthless streak that I admire. He leaned in to kiss her, and Kristen let him, forcing herself not to recoil from his touch. When he pulled away, she managed to smile. I should go. If I'm not back soon, my sister will start asking questions. Of course. I'll text you the details tomorrow. As Kristen walked back to her car, she could feel Gordon watching her from the warehouse entrance. She drove exactly the speed limit, took no suspicious routes, and didn't use her phone until she was safely inside her sister's apartment. Then she called Laura Hartman. Did you get all of that? Every word. You just confessed to multiple murders and a detailed plan to kill your husband. That's more than enough to put him away for life. What happens now? Now we spring our own trap. Gordon Myers thinks he's been playing chess while everyone else plays checkers. Tomorrow night, he's going to discover that he's actually been playing against a grandmaster. What about Andrew? Does he know about tomorrow night? Laura's voice carried a hint of amusement. Kristen, your husband has known about Gordon's entire plan for weeks. Tomorrow night's dinner? It was Andrew's idea. What do you mean? I mean that Gordon Myers isn't the only one who's been planning a trap. The difference is Andrew Fish is better at it. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The private dining room at Chez Laurent was everything Gordon Myers had promised. Intimate, secluded, with enough ambient noise from the main restaurant to mask any sounds that might come from inside. The security cameras had indeed been adjusted to create blind spots, just as Gordon had arranged. What Gordon didn't know was that Andrew Fish owned Chez Laurent. He also didn't know that the adjusted cameras had been replaced with military-grade surveillance equipment that captured everything in high definition, or that the private dining room had been equipped with recording devices sensitive enough to pick up whispered conversations from 50 feet away. Most importantly, he didn't know that Detective Herbert Valencia and 4 Chicago PD officers were positioned throughout the restaurant, ready to move at a moment's notice. Andrew Fish sat across from his wife in the elegantly appointed dining room, playing his role perfectly. To anyone watching, he was a loving husband trying to reconcile with his estranged wife over an intimate dinner. I'm glad you called, Andrew said, raising his wine glass. After everything that's happened, I wasn't sure we'd ever be able to talk like this again. Kristen managed to smile, though Andrew could see the terror in her eyes. She'd been magnificent over the past 24 hours, brave enough to confront a killer, smart enough to gather the evidence they needed, and strong enough to see this through to the end. I've been thinking about us, Kristen said, her voice only slightly strained. About what I did, what I said at the restaurant opening. I was wrong, Andrew. About everything. We all make mistakes. Andrew watched Kristen's eyes flick toward the service entrance where Gordon would soon appear. According to the plan, Gordon expected Kristen to drug Andrew's wine during the appetizer course, then help him to the bathroom, where Gordon would be waiting with a syringe full of something that would stop Andrew's heart and make it look like a medical emergency. Instead, when Gordon appeared, he would find Detective Valencia and enough evidence to ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The appetizers arrived, oysters on a half-shell, perfectly prepared and artfully presented. Andrew had always loved this restaurant's attention to detail. It seemed fitting that Gordon Myers would meet his downfall in a place that represented everything he'd tried to steal. To new beginnings, Andrew said, raising his glass again. Kristen raised hers, and Andrew noticed her hand was trembling slightly. To new beginnings. They drank, and Andrew saw Kristen's eyes widen in surprise when he didn't immediately start showing signs of being drugged. The wine is excellent, Andrew said conversationally, though I should mention that I switched our glasses while you were looking at the menu. What? The wine you just drank contained a mild sedative that Gordon gave you to use on me. Don't worry, it's nothing dangerous, just something to make you a little dizzy. The real question is whether Gordon used something that would merely incapacitate me or something that would kill me outright. Kristen stared at him in horror. Andrew, what are you? Relax. You're perfectly safe. The wine I actually drank came from a different bottle entirely. Andrew smiled. I've known about tonight's plan for days, Kristen, just like I've known about Gordon's entire scheme from the beginning. The service door opened, and Gordon Myers stepped into the dining room, moving with the confident stride of a man who believed his victory was assured. He was dressed in the standard black clothing of restaurant service staff, carrying a leather medical bag that undoubtedly contained his murder weapons. "Right on time," Andrew said calmly. Gordon froze when he saw that Andrew was alert, awake, and clearly not drugged. His eyes darted between Andrew and Chris. "Good evening, Gordon," Andrew continued. "Or should I call you by one of your other names? You've used so many aliases over the years that it's hard to keep track." Gordon's hand moved toward his bag, but Andrew raised a finger in warning. "I wouldn't recommend reaching for whatever you have in there. This entire room is under surveillance, and there are police officers positioned throughout the restaurant." As if on cue, Detective Valencia and two uniformed officers entered through both the main door and the service entrance, effectively surrounding Gordon. "Gordon Myers," Valencia said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and about a dozen other charges that we'll discuss down at the station." Gordon looked at Kristen with pure hatred. "You set me up, you bitch." "Actually," Andrew said, standing up from the table, "she saved your life. If Kristen hadn't agreed to help us catch you, I would have handled this situation very differently." Andrew walked over to Gordon, who was now handcuffed and being read his rights. "You see, Gordon, you made a critical error in judgment. You assumed that because I'm wealthy, I must be soft. Because I'm civilized, I must be weak. Because I trusted my wife, I must be naive." Andrew's voice dropped to a whisper that only Gordon could hear. "But here's the thing about men who build empires from nothing. We don't get to where we are by letting people destroy us. We get there by destroying them first." He stepped back as the officers prepared to escort Gordon out of the restaurant. "Enjoy prison, Gordon. I've arranged for you to have a very long time to think about your mistakes." As Gordon was led away, Andrew turned to Kristen, who was sitting at the table looking shell-shocked. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About Gordon's real plan?" "About 6 weeks. About your affair?" "About 3 months. About your plan to humiliate me at the restaurant opening?" "From the very beginning." Andrew sat back down across from his wife. "The question now is what you want to do about our marriage." Kristen looked at him with something approaching awe. "You could have had me arrested too. For the fraud, the adultery, the conspiracy. Why didn't you? Because unlike Gordon Myers, you're not a killer. You're not even really a criminal. You're just someone who got manipulated by a very dangerous man." Andrew reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm not saying I forgive you, Kristen. I'm not saying we can go back to the way things were. But I am saying that you have a choice about what happens next." "What kind of choice?" "You can walk away. Take the divorce settlement I'm prepared to offer. Start over somewhere new, and try to build a life that doesn't involve destroying other people." Andrew's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Or you can try to make this work. Try to become the person I thought I was married to. Try to earn back the trust you threw away." Kristen looked into her husband's eyes and saw something she'd never noticed before. Not just wealth or power or intelligence, but genuine strength. The kind of strength that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were capable of. "I don't deserve a second chance," she whispered. "Probably not," Andrew agreed. "But I'm offering one anyway. The question is whether you're brave enough to take it." Outside Chez Laurent, Detective Valencia was securing Gordon Myers in the back of a police car when his phone rang. "Valencia, Detective, this is Laura Hartman. Is the suspect in custody? Safely locked up. Your plan worked perfectly." "Good. There are FBI agents in Portland, Denver, and Seattle who are going to be very interested in questioning Mr. Myers about some cold cases in their jurisdictions." Valencia smiled. "Justice served." "Not quite yet," Laura said. "But it's a start." 3 months later, Andrew Fish stood in the same spot where Atelier had hosted its disastrous grand opening. The restaurant had been completely renovated and reopened under new management as Marcus's Place, a tribute to Laura Hartman's brother and a reminder that sometimes justice required patience, planning, and the willingness to risk everything for what was right. The opening night was everything the original grand opening should have been: elegant, celebratory, and focused on the food rather than the drama. Andrew stood with Kristen, who had chosen to stay and fight for their marriage, watching Chicago's food elites sample the menu that Gordon Myers would never cook again. "Do you think we'll make it?" Kristen asked quietly. Andrew considered the question. "I think we'll make something. Whether it's the marriage we had before or something entirely new, I don't know. But I think it'll be honest this time." Kristen nodded. "That's more than I deserve." "Maybe, but it's what we both need." As the evening wound down, Andrew received a text from Laura Hartman. Gordon Myers sentenced to life without parole. Justice for Marcus, finally. Andrew showed the message to Kristen, who read it with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Not just having him arrested, but the whole elaborate plan? All the manipulation and revenge." Andrew thought for a moment. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret stopping a killer from destroying more lives." He looked around the restaurant, at the diners enjoying their meals, at the staff working with pride and professionalism, at his wife standing beside him, trying to become someone worthy of redemption. "Sometimes," Andrew said, "the only way to protect what matters is to be more ruthless than the people who want to destroy it." Gordon Myers had learned that lesson too late. Andrew Fish had learned it just in time. And in the end, that made all the difference. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Nelson Hoover stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, surveying the city skyline that stretched endlessly before him. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, a security consulting firm that now employed over 300 people and held contracts with major corporations across the state. His success hadn't come from luck or inheritance. It came from his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves, and to never, ever let his guard down. "Mr. Hoover?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner with the Richardsons tonight." Nelson's jaw tightened slightly. Terry Richard. The man had been circling his family like a vulture for months, ever since Nelson had helped him secure a lucrative consulting contract with the city planning department. Terry was everything Nelson despised, smooth-talking, entitled, and weak. Yet somehow, his wife Deborah had taken a liking to the man and his wife Sarah. "Tell her I'll be there," Nelson replied, his voice carrying the same controlled tone that had intimidated countless boardroom adversaries. The truth was, Nelson Hoover had learned early in life that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Growing up in the foster system after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8, he'd been shuffled between homes where kindness was rare and betrayal was common. His younger brother Ross had been the only constant in his life, the only person he'd ever truly trusted. When they aged out of the system, Nelson had sworn an oath to himself. He would build something unshakable, something that could never be taken away. And he had. Nelson's security firm specialized in corporate espionage, surveillance, and threat assessment. He'd built a network of contacts in law enforcement, private security, and even some less savory circles. His motto was simple. Information was power, and power was protection. Deborah had been different when they met 15 years ago. She was working as a paralegal, ambitious and driven, with dreams of becoming a lawyer herself. Nelson had been drawn to her intelligence and determination. She seemed to understand the value of building something together, of creating the stable family life neither of them had experienced growing up. They'd married within 2 years, and Alyssa had come along 3 years later. For a while, it had been perfect. Deborah had supported his business ventures, even when they required long hours and frequent travel. She'd eventually given up her law school dreams to focus on raising Alyssa and managing their household, but she'd seemed content with the life they'd built. But lately, things had changed. Deborah had become distant, preoccupied. She'd started going out more frequently, book clubs, charity events, dinner parties. Always with good reasons, always with explanations that made perfect sense. But Nelson Hoover hadn't survived in his business by accepting explanations at face value. The dinner party at the Richardsons' house that evening was a study in suburban perfection. Terry Richard had done well for himself with his urban planning consultancy, though Nelson suspected the man's success had more to do with charm than competence. Their house was a showpiece, all modern fixtures and carefully curated art pieces that screamed of trying too hard. "Nelson," Terry approached with his trademark wide smile and firm handshake. "Glad you can make it. I was just telling the others about that security assessment you did for the Brennan Corporation. Brilliant work." Nelson nodded politely, his eyes scanning the room. Deborah was across the living room, laughing at something Sarah Richard had said. She looked radiant in her blue dress, her blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier. She'd taken extra care with her appearance tonight, he noticed. More than she had for him in months. "You know," Terry continued, moving closer and lowering his voice slightly, "I've been thinking we should collaborate more. Your security expertise and my urban planning background. We could corner the market on comprehensive municipal consulting." "I'll consider it," Nelson replied, though internally he was already cataloging the reasons why he'd never want to be in business with Terry Richard. The man was too eager, too willing to share information, too quick to trust. These were fatal flaws in Nelson's world. As the evening progressed, Nelson watched. It was what he did best: observe, analyze, and file away details for future use. He noticed how Deborah's eyes lingered on Terry just a fraction too long when he spoke. How she found excuses to move closer to him during conversations. How her laughter became more animated when he was around. Most telling of all was the moment when Terry's phone buzzed during dinner. Nelson saw his wife's hand move almost imperceptibly toward her purse, and sure enough, her phone screen lit up with a notification. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "Everything all right?" Nelson asked Terry casually. "Oh, just work," Terry replied quickly, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "You know how it is." But Nelson did know how it was. He knew the signs of deception, the micro-expressions that betrayed lies, the nervous habits that emerged under pressure. Terry Richard was lying, and more importantly, his wife was part of whatever secret they were sharing. The drive home was quiet. Deborah stared out the passenger window, her phone face down in her lap, but close enough to feel any vibrations. Nelson let the silence stretch, a technique he'd learned years ago. Guilty people always felt compelled to fill the void. "The Richardsons certainly know how to entertain," Deborah finally said, her voice carrying a forced lightness. "Terry's an interesting character," Nelson replied neutrally. "He's helped a lot of people in this community. That park renovation project, the new shopping district, he's really making a difference." Nelson almost smiled at how quickly she jumped to Terry's defense. It was confirmation of what he'd already begun to suspect, but hearing it from her own lips still sent a cold spike of fury through his chest. "I'm sure he is," Nelson said. That night, lying in bed beside his wife of 12 years, Nelson Hoover began a plan. Not a business strategy or a security protocol, but something much more personal and infinitely more dangerous. If Deborah thought she could betray him, if she thought she could play him for a fool, she was about to learn why Nelson Hoover's enemies rarely made the same mistake twice. He'd built his empire on the principle that information was power. Now it was time to prove it. Chapter 2, Gathering Storm. 3 weeks later, Nelson sat in his car outside the Riverside Cafe, watching through tinted windows as his wife of 12 years shared what appeared to be an intimate lunch with Terry Richard. She told him she was meeting her sister Kelsey about planning their mother's birthday party. Kelsey Carroll lived 200 miles away and hadn't spoken to Deborah in 6 months. Nelson had confirmed this through a casual phone call the previous day. The surveillance equipment in his vehicle was state-of-the-art, the same technology his firm used for corporate investigations. Through the parabolic microphone aimed at their table, he could hear every word. "Can't keep doing this," Deborah was saying, her hand covering Terry's across the small table. "Nelson's getting suspicious. Last night he asked me 3 different times about where I'd been Tuesday afternoon." Terry leaned closer. "Maybe it's time we told him the truth." Sarah's been asking questions too. She found hotel receipts in my jacket pocket. Are you insane? Deborah's voice carried a sharp edge of panic. Nelson isn't like other men. Terry, you don't understand what he's capable of. I've seen him destroy people who crossed him in business. He's ruthless. He's just a security consultant, Deb. What's the worst he could do? Nelson's grip tightened on the steering wheel. If Terry Richard only knew the full scope of his capabilities, the man would already be running. Nelson's security firm was legitimate, but it existed in the gray areas where corporate interests intersected with less savory methods of problem solving. He had contacts in organized crime, corrupt officials, and mercenaries who specialized in making problems disappear. You don't know him like I do, Deborah continued. He's paranoid, controlling. He probably already knows about us. Then we need to be smarter. I've been thinking, what if we could get him out of the picture entirely? Nelson's blood turned to ice as he listened to Terry outline a plan that involved framing him for corporate espionage, using fabricated evidence to destroy his reputation and his business. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, revealing the depth of their conspiracy and their plans to steal not just his wife, but his life's work. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Nelson saw Deborah hand Terry a manila envelope. Through his telephoto lens, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be photographs and documents, likely sensitive materials from his home office that she'd been systematically copying. That evening, Nelson arrived home to find Deborah in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same domestic routine they'd maintained for years. She kissed his cheek when he entered, her performance so flawless that for a moment he almost doubted what he'd witnessed. "How was your lunch with Kelsey?" he asked, testing her. "Oh, you know how she is. Full of drama about Mom's party. She wants to invite half the county." The lies flowed so easily from her lips that Nelson wondered how long she'd been deceiving him. Months? Years? Their 15-year-old daughter, Alyssa, bounded into the kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, backpack slung over her shoulder. She had Nelson's sharp eyes and stubborn determination, traits that had served her well in school and sports. "Dad, I made varsity soccer," she announced, throwing her arms around his waist. "That's fantastic, sweetheart," Nelson said, genuine pride cutting through the cold fury that had been building all day. Alyssa was innocent in all of this, and protecting her had just become his top priority. "Can we celebrate this weekend? Maybe go to that new restaurant downtown?" "Of course," Nelson replied, already calculating how to use the family outing to his advantage. He'd need to accelerate his timeline. The longer he waited, the more dangerous the situation became. After dinner, Nelson retreated to his home office and activated the secure communication system he used for his most sensitive business operations. His first call was to Stuart Dyer, a private investigator who specialized in matrimonial cases and had previously worked with several law enforcement agencies. "Stuart, I need a complete workup on Terry Richard. Urban planning consultant, lives on Maple Street. I want everything: finances, medical records, criminal background, associations, weaknesses." "How deep you want me to go, Nelson?" "Deep enough to bury him, if necessary." His second call was to Rudy Drew, a former military contractor who now ran a small security firm that handled Nelson's more delicate situations. "Rudy, I need surveillance on 2 targets. Round-the-clock coverage, full documentation. And I need it to be invisible. What's the timeline?" "Starting tomorrow. This is personal, and it's priority 1. His third call was to his brother Ross, who worked as a federal prosecutor in the state capitol. Ross had always been the moral compass of the family, but Nelson knew his brother's loyalty ran deeper than his ethics. "Ross, I need a favor. Hypothetically, if someone were attempting to steal corporate secrets and frame an innocent party, what would be the best way to build an airtight case?" "Jesus, Nelson, what have you gotten yourself into?" "Nothing yet, but I want to be prepared." The next morning, Nelson implemented the first phase of his plan. He began leaving deliberately falsified documents in his home office, corporate intelligence reports with fictitious data, fake client communications, and manufactured evidence of illegal activities. If Deborah was copying his files for Terry's use, he'd give them exactly what they thought they wanted. Simultaneously, he started adjusting his business operations. Key files were moved to secure off-site locations. Critical employees were quietly briefed on potential security threats. Financial assets were shifted to accounts that Deborah couldn't access. But the most important change was personal. Nelson began studying his wife with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to hostile corporate takeovers. He cataloged her habits, her tells, her emotional triggers. He learned her weaknesses the way a general studies enemy terrain. Within a week, Stewart's investigation revealed that Terry Richard was deeper in debt than his lifestyle suggested. The man was leveraged to the hilt, with gambling debts to some very unpleasant people and a business that was hemorrhaging money despite its successful facade. "He's desperate," Stewart reported during their meeting in Nelson's office. "The kind of desperate that makes men do stupid things." There's also something else. Seems like this isn't his first time mixing business with pleasure. I found evidence of at least 2 other affairs with married clients' wives in his previous city. Nelson filed this information away carefully. Terry Richard wasn't just a threat to his marriage. He was a predator with a pattern. This made what Nelson was planning not just personal revenge, but a public service. As the second week of surveillance continued, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Deborah and Terry were meeting almost daily, always in different locations, always with elaborate cover stories. They'd been planning this for months, possibly longer. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was strategic, calculated, and designed to destroy everything Nelson had built. On Friday evening, as Nelson watched his wife prepare for another book club meeting, he realized that the woman he'd loved and trusted for over a decade was essentially a stranger. The Deborah he'd married would never have been capable of such systematic deception. But Nelson Hoover had built his career on adapting to new threats and evolving challenges. His wife and her lover had made the mistake of underestimating him, of seeing him as just another victim in their scheme. They were about to learn otherwise. Chapter 3. The Unveiling. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Nelson was in his home office, reviewing the latest surveillance reports when his secure phone rang. Detective Simon Fitzgerald's voice was tense. "Nelson, you need to see this. We've got security footage from your neighborhood that you're going to want to look at. Can you meet me at the station?" "What kind of footage?" "The kind that explains why your wife's car was parked at Terry Richard's house for 6 hours today while you were supposedly in Chicago." Nelson had fabricated the Chicago trip as a test, telling Deborah he'd be gone overnight on emergency business. He'd actually spent the day in a hotel 20 minutes away, monitoring the situation remotely through his surveillance network. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to the police station felt surreal. Nelson had been gathering evidence for weeks, but seeing it presented by law enforcement added a weight of official reality that made his chest tight with controlled rage. Detective Fitzgerald led him to a small viewing room where a large monitor displayed a grid of security camera angles. The detective was a longtime contact who occasionally worked with Nelson's firm on corporate cases involving theft or fraud. "This is from a Stevens house across the street from yours," Fitzgerald explained, pulling up a timestamp from that afternoon. "Mrs. Stevens had some break-ins last month, so they installed a pretty comprehensive system." The footage was crystal clear. Nelson watched his wife's silver sedan pull into Terry Richards' driveway at 1:15 p.m. Deborah emerged from the car, wearing a red dress Nelson had never seen before, carrying what appeared to be an overnight bag. "That's not the interesting part," Fitzgerald continued, fast-forwarding the feed. "This is..." At 7:30 p.m., the camera captured Terry and Deborah loading boxes into her car. Even from across the street, it was clear they were moving items hastily, both of them constantly checking over their shoulders. "Now watch this," Fitzgerald said, switching to a camera angle that showed the side of Terry's house. This was taken around midnight last night. The new footage showed Terry burying something in his backyard, working by the light of a small flashlight. He was alone, but the activity was clearly secretive and urgent. "We ran the plates on 2 other vehicles that have been regular visitors to the Richard house," Fitzgerald continued. "One belongs to a known fence named Chris Proctor. The other is registered to an identity that doesn't exist," Fake license, fake registration. Nelson studied the detective's face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking your wife and her boyfriend have gotten themselves involved in something bigger than an affair. Those boxes they were loading? My guess is stolen goods. And whatever Terry buried in his yard. That's not typical cheating husband behavior. The pieces clicked into place for Nelson. Terry's financial desperation, the secretive meetings, the systematic copying of documents from his office. They weren't just planning to frame him for corporate espionage. They were running some kind of theft operation, possibly using Terry's urban planning connections to identify valuable targets. I need you to see something else, Nelson said, pulling out his phone. But this conversation stays between us. He showed Fitzgerald selected excerpt from his surveillance footage, enough to demonstrate the scope of the conspiracy without revealing his own illegal surveillance methods. Jesus Christ, Nelson, how long has this been going on? At least 3 months that I can prove. Possibly longer. Fitzgerald leaned back in his chair. You know, I can't act on illegally obtained evidence. But if you happen to discover some of this through legitimate means, I understand. There's something else. I pulled Terry Richards' background deeper than usual. He's got a sealed juvenile record and an arrest for fraud in California that was dismissed on a technicality. This guy's a career criminal who's gotten good at flying under the radar. Nelson felt the last piece of his plan click into place. How long do I have before you have to take action on what you've shown me? Officially? I haven't shown you anything. Unofficially? If evidence of criminal activity came to light through proper channels, I'd have to investigate immediately. Understood. The drive home was when Nelson made his final decision. He'd been planning to expose Deborah and Terry, to destroy them financially and socially. But now he understood that they weren't just betraying him. They were criminals who had brought danger into his home, around his daughter. That changed everything. At 12:30 a.m., Nelson stood outside his own house, watching the windows for signs of movement. Deborah's car was in the driveway, but the master bedroom was dark. She was either asleep or pretending to be. He used his key quietly, disabling the alarm system with practiced efficiency. The house was silent as he moved through the familiar rooms, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, too tense. As he approached the staircase, he heard voices, hushed but urgent, coming from the bathroom down the hall. His wife's voice strained with fear, his mother's voice sobbing, and his brother Ross, who wasn't supposed to be here at all. Nelson moved silently up the stairs, his training taking over. The bathroom door was closed, but light spilled from underneath. As he got closer, he could make out the words. Told you this would happen, his mother Maddie was saying through her tears. I told you Nelson would find out. Mom, please, we can fix this. Deborah's voice was desperate. He doesn't have to know everything. Know what? That was Ross, and his voice carried a weight that Nelson had never heard before. Deb, what you've done. What you've both done. There's no coming back from this. Nelson's hand froze on the doorknob as the implications hit him. Ross was here. His brother, the one person he'd trusted completely, was involved in this conspiracy. Your daughter will never forgive us after this, his mother sobbed. Alyssa doesn't deserve to learn the truth like this. You can't go in, came Ross's shaking voice as footsteps approached from inside the bathroom. You don't want to see this. But Nelson had already heard enough. His brother's betrayal cut deeper than his wife's infidelity, deeper than any corporate espionage or theft scheme. Ross had been part of this from the beginning. With controlled fury that had been building for weeks, Nelson kicked down the bathroom door. The scene that greeted him was even worse than he'd imagined. Deborah was kneeling on the floor, frantically shredding documents and flushing them down the toilet. His mother sat on the edge of the bathtub, clutching a photo of Nelson and Ross as children, tears streaming down her face. And Ross stood frozen by the window, a gun in his trembling hand. But it was what was scattered across the bathroom counter that made Nelson's blood run cold. Photographs of Alyssa. Surveillance photos taken without her knowledge, detailed information about her daily routines, her school schedule, her friends. They hadn't just been planning to destroy him financially. They'd been preparing to use his own daughter as leverage. The room fell silent as everyone turned to stare at Nelson standing in the doorway. In that moment, Looking at the three people he'd trusted most in the world, Nelson Hoover felt the last remaining piece of his humanity simply switch off. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the same deadly calm that had preceded the destruction of every enemy he'd ever faced. "This is interesting." The war had begun. Chapter 4. Information Warfare. The silence in the bathroom stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Ross broke it, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nelson, I can explain." "No," Nelson interrupted, his tone carrying the same cold precision he used in hostile corporate negotiations. "You really can't." He stepped fully into the bathroom, his eyes cataloging every detail. The shredded documents floating in the toilet water, the surveillance photos of his daughter spread across the counter, his mother's tear-stained face, his wife's desperate expression, and most importantly, the service weapon in his brother's shaking hand. "Put the gun down, Ross." "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because we both know what happens next if I do." Nelson almost smiled. His brother understood him better than the others realized. "What happens next is that you all sit down and explain to me exactly how long you've been planning to destroy my life and threaten my daughter." Deborah started to speak, but Nelson cut her off with a raised hand. "Not you. You've had months to explain." "Ross, start talking." His brother's federal prosecutor training was evident as he attempted to maintain control of the situation. "Nelson, you need to understand that this wasn't supposed to involve Alyssa. The photos, the surveillance, that was Terry's idea. We told him it was too far. Mom knew about the affair. I've been helping Deborah prepare for the divorce proceedings." Nelson's gaze shifted to his mother, who couldn't meet his eyes. "And you thought involving a federal prosecutor in marriage fraud was a good idea?" "I thought I could help negotiate a fair settlement," Ross continued. "I didn't know about Terry's criminal activities until last week." "But you knew about the industrial espionage." "What?" Ross's confusion seemed genuine. Nelson pulled out his phone and played a recorded conversation between Deborah and Terry discussing their plan to steal his client files and frame him for corporate crimes. As the recording played, he watched Ross's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, understanding. "Jesus Christ," Ross whispered. "You told me this was just about getting out of an unhappy marriage." "It was," Deborah protested. "Terry said we needed insurance, something to make sure Nelson couldn't use his connections to destroy me in court. So you decided to steal classified corporate intelligence and frame your husband for federal crimes." Ross's prosecutor instincts were taking over. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Nelson watched this exchange with growing satisfaction. The conspiracy was fracturing exactly as he'd hoped. "Keep going, Ross. What else don't you know about your co-conspirators?" Over the next hour, using a combination of recorded conversations, photographs, and financial records, Nelson systematically revealed the full scope of Terry's criminal enterprise. The affair had been a secondary objective. Terry's primary goal was using Deborah's access to steal corporate secrets and client information that could be sold to competitors. "He's been using Deborah to identify high-value targets," Nelson explained, showing them surveillance footage of Terry meeting with known corporate spies. "Her position as my wife gave her access to sensitive client information. The affair was just a way to ensure her cooperation." His mother finally spoke, her voice broken. "Deborah, is this true?" "I didn't know," Deborah insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "Terry said he just needed to understand Nelson's business better." Nelson played another recording, this one of Deborah explicitly discussing the sale of client information to Terry's contacts. "This was recorded 3 days ago, Deborah." "Stop lying." Ross lowered the gun slightly. "Nelson, I had no idea about any of this. You have to believe me." "What I believe," Nelson said, "is that you helped my wife plan to divorce me, hide assets, and destroy my reputation in court. Whether you knew about the rest is irrelevant. I'm your brother. My brother wouldn't have conspired against me behind my back for months." Nelson's phone buzzed with a text message. "Perfect timing. That's Detective Fitzgerald. He's requesting my immediate presence at the police station to identify stolen property recovered from Terry Richards' house." The blood drained from Deborah's face. "What stolen property?" "The boxes you helped him load into your car yesterday." The ones containing corporate documents, client files, and about $40,000 in bearer bonds that Terry stole from various sources. Nelson had orchestrated Terry's arrest through a carefully planned sequence of anonymous tips, planted evidence, and strategic information sharing with law enforcement. Terry was currently sitting in a holding cell, completely unaware that his arrest was part of a larger design. Ross, as a federal prosecutor, you understand that harboring a fugitive and conspiracy to commit fraud are serious charges. I'm not harboring anyone. No, because Deborah is facing charges for conspiracy, theft of corporate secrets, and accessory to fraud. By helping her hide assets and plan false testimony, you've made yourself an accessory after the fact. Ross's legal training was warring with his family loyalty, exactly as Nelson had predicted. What do you want? I want the truth. All of it. Every meeting, every plan, every conversation. And I want you to understand that your choice right now determines whether you're treated as a victim of manipulation or as a co-conspirator. Over the next 2 hours, sitting in that bathroom at nearly 3 a.m., Nelson extracted a complete confession from all 3 conspirators. The picture that emerged was even worse than he'd suspected. The affair had started 6 months ago, but the planning went back almost a year. Deborah had approached Ross first, claiming that Nelson was becoming emotionally abusive and controlling. She'd asked for advice about divorce proceedings and asset protection. Ross, driven by childhood memories of their foster care experiences and a protective instinct toward family, had agreed to help. He'd connected Deborah with discreet legal resources and helped her understand how to document potential abuse claims. Terry had entered the picture 3 months later, initially as a potential romantic interest for Deborah after her divorce. But as their relationship developed, Terry had begun pressuring her for access to Nelson's business information, claiming he needed to understand what they were up against. He said Nelson was dangerous, Deborah explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. He showed me articles about corporate espionage cases, said that people in your business sometimes used violence to protect their interests. So you gave him access to our home office. Just a few files at first. He said he needed to know if you were monitoring me, if you had surveillance equipment in the house. And then he started asking for specific client information. He said his contacts in urban planning could help identify if you were involved in anything illegal. Nelson felt a cold admiration for Terry's manipulation skills. The man had played on Deborah's fears and guilt, gradually escalating her involvement until she was completely compromised. What about the photographs of Alyssa? This question broke Deborah completely. She dissolved into tears, unable to speak for several minutes. Ross answered instead. Terry claimed he needed insurance. He said if you discovered the affair, you might try to use your connections to take Alyssa away from Deborah. The surveillance was supposed to document that Alyssa was safe and happy, to counter any claims of parental unfitness. And you believe that? I wanted to believe it, Ross admitted. The alternative was accepting that I'd help put my niece in danger. Nelson studied the 3 broken people sitting in his bathroom, surrounded by the evidence of their conspiracy. A year ago, he might have felt pity for them. Now, he felt only the cold satisfaction of a problem correctly analyzed and solved. Here's what's going to happen, he announced. Ross, you're going to recuse yourself from any case involving Terry Richard and his associates. You're going to provide a full written statement to Detective Fitzgerald detailing your involvement in this conspiracy. And you're going to recommend that Deborah cooperate fully with the investigation. Nelson, I'm not finished. Deborah, we're going to move out of this house immediately. You're going to sign a divorce agreement that gives me full custody of Alyssa. And you're going to testify against Terry Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. What if I refuse? Nelson smiled for the first time that night. Then I released the evidence I've gathered to the FBI, the IRS, and the State Bar Association. Terry Richard goes to federal prison for espionage. You go to state prison for conspiracy. And Ross loses his license to practice law and faces federal charges for corruption. You're bluffing. Am I? Ross, tell her about my reputation for bluffing. Ross met his brother's eyes and shook his head slowly. He's not bluffing, Deb. He never bluffs. But I'm also not unreasonable, Nelson continued. Cooperate fully. and I'll ensure that the charges against you are minimal. You'll serve your time, and when you get out, you'll be free to start over somewhere else. Far away from here. And us? Ross asked quietly. Nelson looked at his brother, the person who had shared his childhood trauma, who had been his closest ally for over 30 years, and felt nothing but cold disappointment. There is no us anymore, Ross. There's just the consequences of your choices. As dawn broke over the city, Nelson Hoover sat alone in his home office, watching through his window as his wife, mother, and brother left his house for the last time. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. But Terry Richard was still alive, still breathing, still existing in the same world as his daughter. That was a problem that required a more permanent solution. Chapter 5. The Art of Destruction. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal professionals, and curious onlookers who had followed the case of Terry Richard's spectacular downfall. Nelson sat in the gallery, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a scientist watching a carefully controlled experiment. Terry looked haggard after 6 weeks in county jail awaiting trial. His expensive clothes had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and his confident demeanor had crumbled into the desperate anxiety of a man finally understanding the scope of his predicament. Deborah sat at the prosecutor's table as the state's key witness, her testimony having already sealed Terry's fate. She'd been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation, but Nelson knew her reprieve was temporary. He had plans for her that extended far beyond the criminal justice system. The defendant used his position as an urban planning consultant to identify vulnerable targets. The prosecutor was explaining to the jury. He seduced married women, gained access to their homes and personal information, and systematically robbed them of both material assets and corporate secrets. Nelson had provided the prosecution with a meticulously crafted case that painted Terry as a master manipulator who had victimized multiple families. The truth was more complex, but truth was less important than justice. And Nelson's definition of justice was very specific. Over the past month, while Terry sat in jail and Deborah lived in a cramped apartment across town, Nelson had been busy. His security firm had quietly acquired Terry's consulting business through a series of shell companies. His contacts in the financial industry had ensured that Terry's remaining assets were frozen pending civil litigation. His associates in less legitimate circles had made Terry's time in jail extremely uncomfortable. But the courtroom drama was just theater. The real work was happening behind the scenes. Mr. Hoover, Detective Fitzgerald approached him during a recess. I wanted to thank you again for your cooperation in this case. Your evidence made all the difference. Just doing my civic duty, Nelson replied. There is one thing that's been bothering me, though. Some of the surveillance footage you provided, the quality is almost too good. Professional-grade equipment, perfect positioning, like someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Nelson met the detective's eyes without flinching. I've always believed in being prepared, detective. I'm sure you have. Just remember that vigilante justice, no matter how satisfying, tends to create more problems than it solves. I'll keep that in mind. That evening, Nelson drove to the county jail for his scheduled visit with Terry Richard. The two men sat across from each other in the sterile visiting room, separated by reinforced glass and speaking through telephone handsets. You son of a bitch, Terry snarled. You set me up. You orchestrated this whole thing. I simply provided law enforcement with evidence of your crimes, Nelson replied calmly. Bullshit. You planted half that evidence. You manipulated the whole situation. Prove it. Terry's face flushed with impotent rage. I know who you really are, Nelson. I know about your contacts, your methods. You're not just some security consultant. You're a criminal who hides behind legitimate business. Interesting theory. Unfortunately, you'll be spending the next 15 years in federal prison, so your opinions on my business practices aren't particularly relevant. 15 years. Nelson smiled. Oh, you haven't heard about the additional charges? The FBI discovered that some of those corporate secrets you stole involved defense contractors. That makes it espionage. Federal crime, mandatory minimum sentence. The color drained from Terry's face. You can't. I didn't know those files contained classified information. Ignorance isn't a defense. But don't worry. I'm sure you'll find prison educational. Nelson leaned closer to the glass. I want you to understand something, Terry. What's happened to you so far isn't punishment. It's just the appetizer. The real consequences for threatening my family are just beginning. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Brett Schmidt, your cellmate. Interesting man. He's serving time for aggravated assault, but he also has 3 daughters of his own. He's very protective of children, very angry at men who prey on families. Terry's eyes widened as he understood the implication. You can't do this. There are rules, even in prison. Are there? I wouldn't know. I've never been to prison. Nelson stood to leave, then paused. Oh, and Terry? Your former business associates, the ones you owed money to before you got desperate enough to steal from my wife, they're very disappointed that you'll never be able to pay them back. I understand they've put a bounty on your head. Nothing fatal, just educational. Wait. Terry's voice cracked. What do you want? Money? I'll pay you back everything. I'll disappear, leave the country. What I want, Nelson said quietly, is for you to understand that some mistakes can't be fixed. Some people can't be reasoned with. And some consequences are permanent. As Nelson walked away from the jail, he felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion. Terry Richard was finished. His life, his freedom, his future were all destroyed. But destroying Terry had been the easy part. The hard part was what came next. Deborah was waiting for him at the restaurant where they'd had their first date 15 years ago. She looked older, worn down by the stress of the past few months. Her hand shook slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. Thank you for meeting me, she said. You said it was about Alyssa. It is. I want to see her. No. Nelson, please. I know I've lost the right to be her mother, but I love her. I need her to know that none of this was her fault. You're right about one thing. You've lost the right to be her mother. Deborah's eyes filled with tears. I know you hate me. I know I destroyed everything we built together. But she's innocent in all this. Yes, she is. Which is why she doesn't need to be reminded of your existence. I'm still her mother. No, Nelson said, his voice carrying absolute finality. You're the woman who put my daughter in danger, who photographed her without her knowledge, who conspired with a criminal to destroy her father. You're not her mother anymore. The court gave me visitation rights. Nelson pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. Those rights have been terminated. The family court reviewed additional evidence about your involvement in Terry's criminal activities. They determined that you pose a continuing threat to Alyssa's safety and well-being. Deborah opened the envelope with trembling hands. As she read the court documents, her face went white. This says I conspired to kidnap her. The surveillance photos, the detailed information about her schedule, the fake identities Terry was using, it all points to a kidnapping plot. Whether that was your intention is irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself. You fabricated this. Prove it. The same words he'd used with Terry, delivered with the same cold finality. Deborah stared at him across the table, finally understanding the full scope of what she was facing. What happens now? Now you disappear. You take the immunity deal, you serve whatever minimal sentence the court imposes, and then you start over somewhere far away from here. And if I don't? Nelson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that made Deborah shrink back in her chair. Then I stopped being reasonable. I don't understand. Deborah, you spent months gathering intelligence about my business, my clients, my methods. You must have learned something about the kind of work I really do. She had. Nelson could see it in her face, the dawning recognition of what she'd unleashed by betraying him. I'm not just a security consultant, Nelson continued. I'm a problem solver. I make threats go away, usually through legal means, sometimes through financial pressure, occasionally through methods that exist in the gray areas between legal and illegal. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining your options. You can disappear voluntarily, or you can be disappeared involuntarily. Either way, you're not going to be part of Alyssa's life. Deborah sat in silence for several minutes, processing the impossible choice she'd been given. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I loved you, Nelson. For 12 years, I really loved you. I know, Nelson replied. That's what makes this so disappointing. As he walked away from the restaurant, leaving Deborah alone with her shattered life, Nelson felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. Terry was destroyed. His mother was too ashamed to show her face in their social circle. Ross had resigned from the prosecutor's office and moved to another state. But there was still one loose end to tie up, one final lesson to teach about the consequences of betraying Nelson Hoover. The lesson was for Alyssa, and it would be the most important education she'd ever receive. Chapter 6. Legacy of Steel. 6 months after the trial, Nelson found his daughter in the backyard, practicing soccer drills with the methodical precision she'd inherited from him. At 16, Alyssa had grown tall and athletic, but it was her eyes that reminded him most of himself. Sharp, observant, constantly analyzing. She'd handled her mother's disappearance better than Nelson had expected. Deborah had taken the immunity deal and quietly relocated to Oregon, where she worked at a legal aid clinic under a different name. The official story was that the divorce had been amicable, and Deborah had simply decided to start fresh after the trauma of being deceived by Terry Richard. "Dad," Alyssa said without stopping her practice, "I know Mom didn't just leave to find herself." Nelson sat down on the porch steps, watching her work. "What makes you say that?" "Because you taught me to notice patterns. Mom was scared the last few months she was here. Not sad, not confused, scared. And people don't relocate across the country because they're sad. What else have you noticed?" Alyssa stopped practicing and turned to face him. "I've noticed that Uncle Ross hasn't called or visited since Mom left. I've noticed that Grandma Maddie won't make eye contact with you. And I've noticed that you've been watching me more carefully, like you're worried about something." Nelson felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. His daughter was too intelligent for her own good. But in his world, intelligence was the only reliable protection. "Sit down, Alyssa. It's time you learned some things about the world." For the next hour, Nelson told his daughter a carefully edited version of the truth. He explained that her mother had been deceived by a criminal who used their relationship to steal from Nelson's business. He described how the situation had escalated to the point where Alyssa herself had been threatened. He outlined the steps he'd taken to protect their family and ensure their safety. "So Mom was working with this Terry guy to steal from you. Your mother made some very poor choices. She got involved with people who were dangerous, and those choices put all of us at risk. And you stopped them. I protected our family." Alyssa was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Finally, she asked the question Nelson had been dreading. "Are you a good person, Dad?" "I'm a person who takes care of the people I love," Nelson replied. "Sometimes that requires doing things that other people might consider wrong. That's not what I asked." Nelson looked at his daughter, this brilliant, perceptive young woman who would soon be making her own choices about right and wrong, and decided she deserved honesty. "No, Alyssa, I'm not a good person. I'm a necessary person. I solve problems that good people can't solve, and I protect things that good people can't protect. Like our family. Like our family. What happened to Uncle Ross?" This was the hardest part to explain. "Ross chose to help your mother, even though he knew it was wrong. He chose her side over our family's safety. So you made him leave too. I gave him the same choice I gave your mother. Disappear voluntarily or be disappeared involuntarily." Alyssa absorbed this with the same analytical calm she applied to everything else. "Do you think I'm a good person? I think you're smart enough to understand that the world isn't divided into good people and evil people. It's divided into people who protect their families and people who put their families at risk. And which one do you want me to be?" Nelson stood up and walked over to where she was sitting. "I want you to be someone who can take care of herself, who can recognize threats before they become dangerous, and who never, ever trusts anyone more than she trusts her own judgment. Like you, like me." Over the following months, Nelson began teaching Alyssa skills that weren't typically part of a teenager's education. Self-defense training, situational awareness, basic surveillance detection, and most importantly, how to read people's motivations and hidden agendas. "The most dangerous people," he explained during one of their evening talks, "are the ones who make you feel safe. Criminals are obvious. Everyone knows to be afraid of them. But the people who really hurt you are the ones you trust. Like Mom and Uncle Ross. Like Mom and Uncle Ross." Alyssa proved to be an exceptional student. She had inherited not just Nelson's analytical abilities, but also his cold pragmatism and his instinct for survival. By her 17th birthday, she could spot a tail, detect listening devices, and identify potential threats in any environment. But more importantly, she had learned to trust no one completely except her father. The transformation was evident in her social relationships. She maintained friendships at school, but kept them superficial. She dated occasionally, but never seriously. She excelled academically, but always had backup plans. She was becoming exactly what Nelson had hoped, a young woman who could never be deceived, manipulated, or betrayed the way he had been. "Sometimes I miss being naive," she told him one evening as they reviewed her college applications. "Naive people get hurt," Nelson replied. "I know, but they also get to trust people. They get to believe that the people they love won't betray them. And look how well that worked out for me." Alyssa was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I'll ever be able to have a normal family? Someone I can trust completely?" Nelson considered the question seriously. "I think you'll be able to have something better than normal. You'll have a family built on honesty instead of illusion. You'll never have to wonder if the people you love are plotting against you. Because I'll always be watching for it. Because you'll always be prepared for it." As Alyssa's high school graduation approached, Nelson realized that his greatest achievement wasn't building a successful business or destroying his enemies. It was creating a daughter who would never be vulnerable the way he had been. She would never trust blindly, never love naively, never assume that family loyalty was unconditional. She would be alone in many ways, but she would be safe. And in Nelson Hoover's world, safety was the only thing that mattered. "Dad," Alyssa said one evening as they went over her college plans, "I've been thinking about what I want to study. And I want to learn everything you know. Business, security, investigation, all of it. I want to be able to do what you do." Nelson felt a mixture of pride and sadness at her words. "It's not an easy life, Alyssa. Easy lives are for people who don't have enemies. And you think you'll have enemies?" She smiled, and for a moment Nelson saw himself reflected in her expression. The same cold calculation, the same ruthless pragmatism. "I think everyone has enemies, Dad. Most people just don't realize it until it's too late." As Nelson looked at his daughter, brilliant, beautiful, and completely without illusions about human nature, he realized that he had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Deborah's betrayal had cost him his faith in love and family, but had given him something more valuable, a daughter who would never be naive enough to trust anyone completely. The lesson was complete. The legacy was secure. And Nelson Hoover, for the first time in months, allowed himself to smile. Chapter 7. The Final Account. 2 years later, Nelson stood in the cemetery where his parents were buried, a place he visited only on the anniversary of their death. Alyssa stood beside him, now 19 and home from her first year at Columbia University, where she was double majoring in criminal justice and international business. "I got a letter from Mom yesterday," she said quietly. Nelson's expression didn't change, but his entire body tensed. "What did it say?" "She wants to see me. She's getting married to some lawyer in Portland, and she wants me to be at the wedding." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Nelson had always known this moment would come. Deborah had honored their agreement for 2 years, staying away and building a new life, but maternal instincts were powerful forces that rarely stayed buried forever. "What do you want to do?" Alyssa was quiet for several minutes, staring at their parents' headstone. "I want to understand why she did it. Not the whole conspiracy with Terry. I understand that. I want to understand why she chose a stranger over her own family. And you think seeing her will give you those answers?" "I think I need to look her in the eye and see if there's anything left of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories." Nelson nodded slowly. "Then we'll go to Portland." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. If you're going to face your mother, you're not doing it alone." The flight to Portland was tense. Alyssa had grown into a formidable young woman, tall, confident, and possessed of the same predatory intelligence that had made Nelson successful. But she was still his daughter, and the prospect of seeing Deborah again clearly unsettled her. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Alyssa said as their plane descended toward the airport. "It's overrated," Nelson replied. "Is it? I mean, what if holding on to anger is just another way of letting the people who hurt you control your life?" Nelson studied his daughter's profile as she looked out the airplane window. Are you planning to forgive your mother? I'm planning to understand her. There's a difference. They met Deborah at a small cafe in downtown Portland. She looked older, softer somehow, with gray threading through her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She was wearing a simple dress and a modest engagement ring, and when she saw Alyssa, she began to cry immediately. You're so beautiful, Deborah whispered, reaching out tentatively as if she wasn't sure she had the right to touch her own daughter. Alyssa submitted to the embrace, but Nelson could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself ready to pull away at any moment. Hello, Nelson, Deborah said, her voice carefully neutral. Deborah. They sat at a corner table, three people connected by blood and history, but separated by choices that couldn't be undone. For the first few minutes, the conversation was stilted, formal, updates about school, work, the weather. Finally, Alyssa cut through the pleasantries. I need you to explain something to me, Mom. I need to understand how you could choose Terry Richard over your own family. Deborah's composure cracked slightly. It wasn't that simple, sweetheart. Then make it simple for me. Over the next hour, Deborah told her version of the story. She talked about feeling trapped in a marriage that had become cold and distant. She described her growing fear of Nelson's business associates and methods. She explained how Terry had seemed to offer an escape from a life that felt increasingly dangerous and isolated. I was scared, she concluded, not just of your father, but of the kind of life we were living. The security measures, the constant suspicion, the way he taught you to see enemies everywhere. So you decided to prove him right, Alyssa said quietly. What? You decided to actually become the enemy he was watching for. Deborah flinched as if she'd been slapped. That's not. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But you did hurt us. You hurt me. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. Alyssa leaned forward, her eyes intense. Are you sorry because you got caught? Or are you sorry because you did it? I'm sorry because I chose fear over family. I'm sorry because I let a manipulative man convince me that betraying you and your father was somehow protecting you. And now I've learned to live with the consequences of my choices. Nelson watched this exchange with growing respect for his daughter's interrogation skills. She was methodically stripping away Deborah's justifications and self-deceptions, forcing her to confront the reality of what she'd done. Tell me about your fiancé, Alyssa continued. David? He's a good man. He worked for legal aid, helps people who can't afford lawyers. Does he know about your past? He knows I'm divorced, that I made some mistakes that cost me my relationship with my daughter. Does he know you conspired to commit corporate espionage? Deborah's face went pale. Alyssa, please. Does he know you helped gather intelligence that was used to threaten a minor? It wasn't supposed to go that far, but it did go that far. And now you want me to be happy for you because you found someone new to lie to. The cafe fell silent around their table. Other customers were beginning to stare, sensing the intensity of the conversation, even if they couldn't hear the words. I want you to be happy because your mother has found some peace, Deborah said quietly. My mother died 2 years ago, Alyssa replied. You're just the woman who used to live in her body. Nelson felt a surge of pride and sadness as he watched his daughter deliver this final verdict. She had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. Deborah was crying openly now, her carefully constructed new life crumbling under the weight of her daughter's judgment. Please, Alyssa, I know I can't undo what I did, but I love you. I've always loved you. Love isn't enough, Alyssa said, standing up from the table. Dad taught me that. Love without loyalty, without honesty, without sacrifice. That's just selfishness wearing a pretty mask. As they prepared to leave, Deborah made one last desperate attempt. Nelson, please, don't let her leave like this. She's her daughter. Nelson looked at the woman who had once been his wife, the mother of his child, the person he'd trusted more than anyone in the world. She's my daughter, he corrected. You gave up the right to call her yours when you chose Terry Richard over her safety. I made a mistake. No, Nelson said, his voice carrying the same finality it had held in their bathroom 2 years ago. You made a choice, and choices have consequences. On the flight back to New York, Alyssa was unusually quiet. Finally, As they reached cruising altitude, she spoke. I thought seeing her would give me closure. And did it? It gave me something better. It gave me certainty. About what? About who I want to be. About the kind of person I never want to become. Nelson nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Any regrets? Only one, Alyssa said. I regret that it took me so long to understand that some betrayals are unforgivable. That's a hard lesson. All the important lessons are hard. As their plane carried them home, Nelson reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Deborah's betrayal had destroyed his faith in love and family, but had also created something stronger, a bond with his daughter built on shared understanding rather than naive trust. They would never be a normal family. Alyssa would never have the innocent relationships that other young women her age took for granted. But she would also never be vulnerable to the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them both. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because in Nelson Hoover's world, survival was more important than happiness, and strength was more valuable than love. And as he looked at his daughter, brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely ruthless, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would be ready for them. The student had surpassed the teacher. The legacy was complete. Chapter 8, Blood and Judgment. 3 years had passed since the confrontation in Portland when the call came that would test everything Nelson had taught his daughter. Alyssa was in her final year at Columbia, preparing for law school, when Detective Fitzgerald contacted Nelson with news that sent ice through his veins. Terry Richard was found dead in his cell this morning, Fitzgerald reported. Apparent suicide, but there are some irregularities that have the warden asking questions. Nelson kept his voice neutral. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest maybe it wasn't suicide after all. The kind that point to someone with resources and connections orchestrating events from the outside. Are you suggesting I had something to do with this? I'm suggesting that Terry Richard had a lot of enemies, and some of them might have decided that 15 years in federal prison wasn't justice enough. Nelson understood the subtext. Fitzgerald was giving him a warning, not an accusation. I appreciate the heads-up, Detective. Nelson, I've known you for 8 years. I've seen you solve problems that other people couldn't handle. But if you've crossed the line from problem-solving to problem elimination, you need to be very careful. There are people paying attention now. That evening, Nelson sat in his home office, staring at the secure phone that connected him to networks he'd hoped never to use again. Terry Richard's death hadn't been his doing directly, but he'd certainly set the wheels in motion by ensuring that certain information reached certain people in the federal prison system. The door opened, and Alyssa entered without knocking, a privilege she'd earned through years of proving her trustworthiness. I saw the news about Terry, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. And I want to know if you killed him. Nelson met his daughter's eyes without flinching. Would it matter if I did? It would matter to me. Why? Alyssa was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Because I need to understand where the line is. I need to know how far you're willing to go to protect our family. How far do you think I should be willing to go? As far as necessary. Nelson felt the chill at the matter-of-fact way she delivered this statement. Even if that includes murder. Even if that includes whatever it takes to keep the people I love safe. They sat in silence for several minutes. Two people bound by blood and shared understanding, contemplating the moral territory they were mapping together. I didn't kill Terry Richard, Nelson finally said, but I made sure that the people who did kill him understood that his death would be appreciated. That's not the same thing as murder. Legally, it absolutely is the same thing. I could be charged as an accessory to homicide, but morally, Nelson studied his daughter's face, seeing his own ruthless pragmatism reflected in her features. Morally, Terry Richard stopped being a person when he threatened my family. Everything that happened to him after that was just consequences. I understand. Do you? Because once you cross certain lines, Alyssa, you can never go back. Once you accept that some people deserve to die, you change into something that most of society would consider monstrous. And you think I'm not ready for that. I think you're 22 years old, and you shouldn't have to make these choices yet. Alyssa leaned forward, her expression intense. But I am making these choices, Dad. Every day. Every time I decide who to trust, who to help, who to protect. The only difference between us is that you've had to deal with the consequences of those choices, and I haven't. Yet, the truth of her words hit Nelson like a physical blow. His daughter wasn't an innocent being corrupted by his influence. She was a natural predator who had inherited his instincts and refined them through his teaching. The realization was both terrifying and incredibly proud. There's something else, Alyssa continued. Something I need to tell you. What? Mom's fiancé contacted me last week. David, the lawyer from Portland. Nelson's entire body tensed. What did he want? He wanted to warn me that Mom is planning to file a motion to regain visitation rights. She's claiming that enough time has passed, that she's rehabilitated, that she deserves a chance to rebuild our relationship. And what did you tell him? I told him that if she tries to insert herself back into our lives, I'll destroy her the same way you destroyed Terry. Nelson stared at his daughter, seeing not the child he'd raised, but the woman she'd become, cold, calculating, and absolutely lethal when threatened. Alyssa, you can't. Can't what? Can't protect myself? Can't defend the family I chose to keep? Can't apply the lessons you taught me? You can't threaten your mother. Why not? Because she gave birth to me? Because we share DNA? You taught me that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. You proved it when you cut off Uncle Ross and Grandma Maddie. Nelson realized he was seeing the final evolution of his daughter's education. She had learned his lessons so thoroughly that she was now prepared to apply them to anyone, including the woman who had given her life. What exactly did you tell David? I told him that Mom made her choice when she betrayed our family. I told him that she gave up the right to be part of my life when she chose a criminal over her own daughter. And I told him that if she pushes this issue, I'll make sure that her new husband learns exactly what kind of woman he's planning to marry. You're talking about destroying an innocent man's life to get to her. I'm talking about protecting myself from a woman who has already proven she can't be trusted. David seems like a nice man, but nice men deserve to know the truth about the women they're marrying. Nelson felt a moment of vertigo as he realized that his daughter had not only learned his methods, but had surpassed them. Where he had been content to exile Deborah and move on, Alyssa was prepared to wage total war against anyone who threatened the life they'd built. What if David told her what you said? He did. She called me yesterday, and she was crying, begging me to reconsider, promising that she's changed, that she would never hurt us again. What did you tell her? Alyssa's smile was cold and absolutely ruthless. I told her that promises from her are worthless. I told her that she had one chance to be part of my life, and she threw it away when she chose Terry Richard over her family. And I told her that if she files any legal motions, if she tries to force her way back into our lives, I'll systematically destroy everything she's built in Portland. Ow! The same way you would, Dad. Information warfare. I'll expose her criminal history to David's law firm, to their social circle, to the legal aid organization where she works. I'll make sure that everyone in her new life knows exactly what she did to her first family. Nelson sat back in his chair, simultaneously horrified and impressed by his daughter's tactical thinking. And if that's not enough, then I'll get creative. I'll find David's ex-wife, his children from his first marriage, his extended family. I'll make sure they understand that he's marrying a woman who conspired to have her own daughter kidnapped. Alyssa, that's exactly what you would do if someone threatened our family. The only difference is that you'd use intermediaries. I'm prepared to do it myself. Nelson looked at his daughter and saw the culmination of everything he'd created. A young woman who was completely without sentiment when it came to protecting herself and the people she loved. She had learned his lessons so well that she was now prepared to be more ruthless than he'd ever been. There's something you need to understand, Nelson said finally. Once you start down this path, once you begin actively destroying people's lives, you change into something that can never be unchanged. You become someone who sees every relationship as a potential threat, every friendship as a possible betrayal. I already am that person, Dad. You made sure of it. And you're comfortable with that? I'm alive because of it. I'm safe because of it. I'm strong because of it. Nelson realized that his greatest success was also his greatest failure. He'd created a daughter who would never be vulnerable to betrayal, but he'd also created someone who might never be capable of genuine human connection. Do you ever regret learning these lessons? Alyssa considered the question seriously. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to trust people completely, to love without reservation, to believe that the people in my life would never hurt me. And then I remember that people who think that way end up like you did 5 years ago, sitting in their bathroom at 3 in the morning, discovering that their entire family has been plotting against them. Nelson nodded, understanding that his daughter had made the same choice he'd made years ago. She'd chosen strength over happiness, safety over love, control over trust. So what happens now? Now we wait to see if Mom is smart enough to accept the life she's built in Portland, or stupid enough to try to reclaim the family she destroyed here. And if she chooses stupidity, Alyssa's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then she'll learn that the daughter she abandoned isn't nearly as forgiving as the husband she betrayed. As Nelson watched his daughter leave his office, he felt the complex mixture of pride and sorrow that had become familiar over the past few years. He'd succeeded in creating exactly what he'd intended, a young woman who could never be deceived, manipulated, or betrayed. But in the process, he'd also created something else, a predator who was now fully prepared to hunt. The student had indeed surpassed the teacher. The question was whether the world was ready for what they'd unleashed. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 6 months later, Nelson stood in the boardroom of his security firm, looking out at the skyline he'd dominated for over 2 decades. At his side, Alyssa reviewed the final contracts that would transfer operational control of the company to her upon her graduation from law school. At 23, she was already more ruthless and strategically minded than most CEOs twice her age. The Portland situation has been resolved, she reported, her voice carrying the same cold efficiency that had become her trademark. How resolved? Permanently. Mom withdrew her petition for visitation rights and signed a legally binding agreement never to contact me again. David filed for divorce last week. Nelson didn't ask for details. He'd learned that his daughter's methods, while effective, were often more brutal than his own. Any collateral damage? Some. David's legal career is probably over, and Mom will have difficulty finding employment in her field. But they're both alive and free to start over somewhere else. And you're satisfied with that outcome? I'm satisfied that the threat has been neutralized without requiring more extreme measures. Nelson noted the careful phrasing. His daughter had learned to speak in the language of corporate euphemisms when discussing activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. There's something else we need to discuss, Alyssa continued, pulling out a tablet and displaying a series of photographs. I've been monitoring Uncle Ross's activities in California. The photos showed Ross meeting with FBI agents, entering federal buildings, and reviewing documents in what appeared to be a secure facility. He's cooperating with a federal investigation into corporate security firms that operate in legal gray areas, Alyssa explained. Specifically, he's providing information about your methods and client relationships. Nelson felt the familiar cold fury that had driven him for the past 5 years. How long has this been going on? At least 6 months. Maybe longer. He's been very careful, but not careful enough. What's the scope of the investigation? They're building a RICO case. Conspiracy, racketeering, possibly murder charges related to Terry Richards' death. Nelson stood motionless for several minutes, processing this information and its implications. His brother's betrayal had been personal. This betrayal was existential. It threatened not just his freedom, but his life. Recommendations? We have 3 options, Alyssa said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing lunch plans. We can try to discredit Ross's testimony by exposing his own criminal involvement in Mom's conspiracy. We can arrange for certain key evidence to disappear before it reaches federal court. Or we can eliminate the problem at its source. You're talking about killing a federal prosecutor. I'm talking about protecting our family and our business from someone who has chosen to become our enemy. Nelson looked at his daughter and saw the logical endpoint of everything he'd taught her. She was prepared to order the assassination of her own uncle without apparent emotional conflict. There's a 4th option, he said quietly, which is, we disappear. New identities, offshore accounts, Start over in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States. You mean run. I mean strategic withdrawal. Alyssa was quiet for several minutes, considering this option. And leave Ross free to destroy everything we've built? Leave him free to potentially threaten other family members. What other family members? You have cousins, second cousins, family friends who could be caught up in a federal investigation. Are you prepared to abandon all of them? Nelson realized that his daughter was right. Running would save their lives, but it would also mean accepting defeat and leaving others vulnerable to the consequences of Ross's betrayal. What do you recommend? I recommend we solve this problem the same way we've solved all the others. Completely and permanently. You're talking about declaring war on the federal government. I'm talking about defending ourselves against an attack that threatens our survival. Nelson walked to the window and stared out at the city below. Somewhere in those streets were federal agents building a case against him. Somewhere in California was his brother, systematically destroying the family he'd once sworn to protect. If we do this, he said finally, there's no going back. We become the kind of people who kill federal agents and murder family members. We already are those people, Dad. We just haven't had to prove it yet. And you're prepared for that? I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect the life we've built. Nelson turned back to his daughter, seeing in her face the same cold determination that had driven him through every crisis of his adult life. But where his ruthlessness had been forged by betrayal and hardship, hers had been carefully cultivated from childhood. All right, he said. Plan it. Over the next month, Alyssa orchestrated a campaign that was surgical in its precision and devastating in its scope. Ross's federal handlers found their own backgrounds subjected to intensive investigation, their personal lives exposed to public scrutiny, their careers systematically undermined. The federal investigation stalled as key witnesses recanted their testimony. Crucial evidence disappeared from secure facilities, and the lead prosecutors found themselves facing ethics violations that would end their careers. But the masterpiece of Alyssa's plan was the final confrontation with Ross himself. Hello, Uncle Ross, Alyssa said, settling into the chair across from him in the federal safe house where he'd been hiding for the past 2 weeks. Ross looked haggard, his confidence shattered by the systematic destruction of everyone around him. How did you find me? The same way Dad found Mom and Terry 5 years ago. By being smarter, more connected, and more ruthless than the people try to hide from us. Alyssa, you have to understand, I was trying to protect you from him. Your father is dangerous. My father is the man who taught me that family loyalty is the only thing that matters in this world. You're the man who taught me that even family can't be trusted. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did hurt me. You hurt our entire family by choosing to side with federal agents over your own blood. Ross leaned forward desperately. It's not too late. You can still walk away from this life. You can still choose to be something other than what he's made you. Alyssa smiled, and Ross felt his blood turn to ice at the expression. You still don't understand, do you? I'm not Dad's victim. I'm his masterpiece. What do you want? I want you to understand the choice you're facing. You can disappear, new identity, new life, far away from here. Or you can continue cooperating with the federal investigation and face the consequences. What consequences? Alyssa placed a manila envelope on the table between them. Ross opened it with trembling hands, revealing photographs of his new apartment, his new girlfriend, his new colleagues at the legal aid clinic where he'd been working. The consequences of learning that there's nowhere you can hide, nowhere you can run, where my father's reach can't find you. You're threatening to kill me. I'm explaining your options. You betrayed our family once because you thought you were protecting us. If you betray us again, there won't be anyone left to protect. Ross stared at the photographs, understanding that his niece had become something far more dangerous than her father had ever been. Where Nelson was ruthless, Alyssa was methodical. Where Nelson was brutal, Alyssa was surgical. If I disappear, what happens to the federal case? Without your testimony, it collapses. The other witnesses have already been neutralized. And if I refuse, then I'll demonstrate that the lessons Dad taught me weren't just theoretical. Ross looked into his niece's eyes and saw nothing human looking back at him. She had become a creature of pure calculation, devoid of sentiment or mercy. "I'll disappear," he whispered. "Good choice." 6 months later, Nelson and Alyssa stood together on the roof of their building, watching the sun set over a city they had successfully defended against every threat. "Any regrets?" Nelson asked. "Only one," Alyssa replied. "I regret that it took us so long to understand that mercy is just weakness wearing a noble mask." And Ross? Ross chose his fate when he chose strangers over family. Just like Mom. Just like everyone else who thought they could betray us without consequences. Nelson looked at his daughter and felt the complex mixture of pride and horror that had become familiar. He'd succeeded in creating exactly what he'd intended. A young woman who could never be defeated, never be betrayed, never be destroyed. But he'd also created something that might be incapable of love, trust, or genuine human connection. "Do you think we're monsters?" he asked.